Well, good morning, COS Patriots, and welcome to COS Live. My name is Andrew Luce. I'll be your host for this special edition of COS Live. And of course, I'm joined by Rita Peters, who is the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs, but she's also my co host. Rita, it's great to be with you. It's kind of early, but it's great to be with you today. I'm really excited because it's been a banner week this week, and we got more committee hearings. We have another committee hearing today, this time in Montana, and we're going to be tuning into the House Business and Labor Committee hearing, and there's going to be testimony on our Article 5 application. But just to get our viewers caught up, on Tuesday, we passed in South Dakota in the Senate side, and then yesterday, we passed unanimously in a Wyoming Senate committee, and now we're here back again for another committee hearing in Montana. Rita, it's just been an exciting week. The Wild West is going wild for convention of states. Can you help get our viewers caught up with everything that's been going on this past week?
Yeah, well, you gave a pretty good summary. It has been a banner week, as you said. I have to mention our victory in the Wyoming committee yesterday, 5-0, a resounding victory. So South Dakota committee and Wyoming committee have been just great, resounding, strong victories that really send a message that the legislators are ready to use their Article 5 power to rein in Washington, D.C. And, I want to say this always starts with the grassroots, Andrew. The
Mm-hmm.
Convention of States Montana team has been working hard to build support across the state and in the legislature. Over 21,000 Montanans have signed the Convention of States petition. That's a lot of people in a state that's as spread out and sparsely populated as Montana, but they're asking their state legislators to vote yes for COS. Our resolution in Montana has long been championed by Senator Tom McGilvray. He is one of the true American statesmen. He has been working hard, building support in that legislature for many years now. And so we're excited to support him and his work. He, a couple years ago, hosted town halls all across the state. Hundreds of locals would show up at these town hall events to learn about Convention of States and what we're all about. And we were happy to send our senior advisors, Rick Santorum, Mike Ferris, Mark Meckler. We've sent Article 5 scholar Rob Nadelson there. He has a great history and roots in Montana. It's been really impressive. Last year, the team got further legislatively than it ever has before, getting a successful vote in committee and then debate on Montana's Senate floor. But success in the legislative process rarely happens all at once. It takes some time. Progress is usually incremental. And so we hope to see Montana this year get even farther than last session and perhaps even become state number 20. Now, they're going to be in a race with South Dakota and Wyoming at this point for that distinction. And so all of that brings us to today's hearing in the Montana House Business and Labor Committee. We're starting on the House side this year and hopefully getting success there and then passing over to the Senate. COS co-founder and senior advisor Michael Ferris is expected to provide expert testimony virtually. He's standing by online. And of course, we'll hear from members of our local Convention of States team to voice their support. I want to note that we do not expect this committee to vote today. They usually take these matters back and vote later, sometimes in an executive session. If the vote ultimately is successful, probably sometime next week, then our Article 5 resolution would be sent to the full Montana House floor for debate. And there's one more thing I want to mention before we get to the committee hearing today. I talked about our Senate sponsor, Senator Tom McGilvray, who's long been a COS champion. You're going to hear this morning from our House sponsor, who's likely to introduce the bill to this committee. Our House sponsor is Representative Shane Clacken, and he is a freshman who is on fire for convention of states. And he's been working with Senator McGilvery and our other champions in the Montana legislature. And he was just really excited to get into that legislature and take up this leadership role for convention of states. I think you're going to be impressed with him, and I'm excited to see him in action today.
Mm-hmm. I am as well, Rita. We're going to be going in just a moment. Looks like it's on screen. Stay tuned, though, to our viewers. Stay tuned after the vote because we are expected to have reaction from Deanna Beckett, who is the regional director for the Wild West region. She's been on this show quite a bit this week, but excited to have her come again to talk about the how the committee hearing went and just how the Montana team is feeling after the committee hearing. So we'll get a reaction from her in just a little bit later in the program. So it looks like it's on screen. I don't know if we're ready to go there yet, but Rita, it's been a very exciting week. Like we said at the top, it seems that we are just right out of the gates this legislative session. I mean, we've seen victories in South Dakota, in Wyoming now. We're going to Montana. This has just been really, really exciting. And
Yeah.
I think that the country and legislators across the country are just ready to get behind convention of states. And so we hope to see just more victories coming down the pike.
Yeah, there seems to be just a palpable excitement this year about convention of states and all these different states that, we had excitement, of course, in the past, but to me, it seems a little bit elevated this year. And I don't know, I haven't actually checked the stats on this, but it seems like we're getting more momentum this year much earlier in the year. We've already passed a complete chamber in South Dakota. And that may be one of the earliest or the earliest dates in the calendar year for us to ever have passed an entire chamber. I'll have to look into that and get back to you guys on that, Andrew. But I think that just speaks to the excitement. I don't know if part of it maybe comes from a new sort of spirit of encouragement and hope that maybe is, linked with the Trump administration coming in and seeing, the Trump administration on board with, wanting to downsize and rein in the federal government. And then we have these state legislatures that I think are starting to see, yeah, that's what we need to do. And the only way to do that permanently, to make those changes permanent, is to use the Convention of States process, because I think the Trump administration is going to do some great things here in terms of downsizing the federal government. But we all know that, unfortunately, anything the Trump administration does can be undone by a future administration and, future legislation. So if we want to permanently drain the swamp, Andrew, we got to have Convention of States, right?
That's right. And if we really want to see permanent institutional change, or what we've been talking about a lot, is cementing in restrictions on the federal government, it's going to have to be done through constitutional amendments. Can't be done through executive orders or even legislation out of Congress, because that can be undone as well. But it's so much harder to undo constitutional amendments. Just like it's so hard to get constitutional amendments passed and then ratified, it's equally just as hard to get them removed. And so I think that's why there's so many states that are introducing our resolution early on. I mean, Rita, we got 12 states so far in this year that are considering our resolution: Connecticut, Kansas, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Texas, Wyoming. I mean, there's legislation in these state legislatures right now that are being considered that Convention of States is either our resolution or other legislation. So this is just so cool to see all of these states early on. I mean, we're still in January, and we got 12 states that have legislation that's active right now. So and then it looks like this starting, Rita. So we're going to go ahead and go to the committee here and tune in, and we'll be back just a little bit later.
Representative Carter. Representative Gist. Here. Representative Nickel. Here. Representative Fitzpatrick. Representative DeMorris. Here. Representative Sprunger. Representative Manus.
Here.
Representative Teal.
Here.
Representative Isley.
Here.
Representative Seconder.
Here.
Representative Schomer. Representative Sullivan.
Excused.
Representative Steve Fitzpatrick. Representative Lear.
Excused.
And Chair Buttrey.
Here. Members, we have a quorum. We're able to do business. As you can see, we have a large crowd here today. I should also thank the person whose phone went off earlier this week, I believe, or maybe it was last week. And so because of that, we got breakfast. That should also serve as a warning to anyone out there in the audience. If your phone goes off, there is a penalty, which we very much appreciate. So please turn your phones off. The order of hearings today is going to be HJ 5, followed by House Bill 223, then 227. We have a lot of people here for HJ 5. I don't typically put limitations on the time a person can testify, but because we have a lot of work in front of us, what we're going to do is set the limit of an hour for proponents, an hour for opponents, and see how we do with that. So if you're giving testimony, please keep it short. Don't repeat. We like the Me Too's because somebody behind you might get affected if we run out of time. And it's just not the folks in this room. We've got as many people as I've ever seen online to testify. So anything from the committee members before we get rolling? All right, do we have our sponsor here? Yes. We will now open the hearing on House Joint Resolution 5. Go ahead and open, Representative.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee, fellow representatives. My name is Shane Clacken. Last name Klakken. I represent House District 37, Central Montana, Petroleum County, most of Fergus County. I'm here today to introduce House Joint Resolution 5. It's a resolution of the Senate and the House of Representatives of the state of Montana applying for a convention of states. You should have that House Joint Resolution. I just want to cover it a little bit, get some basis covered here. There's a number of whereas statements, and I do want to cover the first one. It says, whereas the founders of our Constitution empowered state legislators to be guardians of liberty against future abuses of power by the federal government. And I don't think there's any doubt that we do see abuses. We have a crushing national debt of $36 trillion and growing. We do have manipulative federal mandates and improper interpretation of Constitution. And just to expound on that before we get too far down the weed, is it's basically redefining words rather than actually changing the Constitution. It is a solemn duty of the states to protect the liberty of the people, particularly for the future generations, by proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States through a convention of states under Article 5. Here's a key point: for the purpose of restraining these and related powers. This application, as you'll see on the bottom of HA 5 that you have in front of you, is limited to 3 purposes. The first purpose is limited to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Number 2 is to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Number 3, limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So you'll notice the term limited. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. And also, as a refresher for Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. Let's underline this Constitution. Or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by convention in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Here's what we need to learn or take out of that Article 5. There's 3 numbers we need to know, we need to remember. We need to remember 34, 26, and 38. It said in there that whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, or on the application of legislatures of 2/3 of the several states. 34 is 2/3. So that's the number of states that have to have this application passed and on file, when that right there will trigger the Congress to call a convention. It says there, when that is met, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. When this convention convenes, when they propose amendments, 26 states have to agree that is a proposed amendment we want to send out for ratification. And then 38 is 3/4 of the 50 states. So anything ratified has to pass 3/4 of the states, and then it's considered to be part of this Constitution. So currently, 19 states have passed the resolution you see in front of you. And it's Alaska, Arizona, Utah, North Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, Wisconsin, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, West Virginia, Florida. I don't know if you're keeping up on your news, but currently right now, South Dakota is getting really close to passing their resolution. This resolution passed the South Dakota Senate Committee 8-1, and it's passed the South Dakota Senate 23-9. Montana's next, and they're actually working on Wyoming right now. I was listening to a podcast last night, an update where it came up really quick for one of their hearings, and they had that yesterday. The requirement for Congress to call a convention of states to propose amendments to the Constitution is a function they're mandated to do when 34 applications are there. And these applications have to be the same. They can't be materially different. Every dot and tittle, they have to have the same topic areas. So that's what makes the convention limited, is the topic areas are narrow. They're defined. And anything that is proposed outside of those 3 topic areas is not germane, and it cannot talk about it. And with that, I'll be ready to sit for questions and be listening to our proponents. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Clacken. We'll start with proponents. If you're an online proponent, please raise your hand. Senator McGilvery, we won't start the clock until you're done.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be here in support of HJ5. For the record, my name is Tom McGilvery. I represent Senate District 26 out of Billings. I'm going to be very brief today, but as Representative Clacken has said, you clearly understand Article 5 has 2 processes to propose amendments. And then the states, there are 2 processes for the states to ratify those amendments, either go through state legislatures or state conventions. I would submit to you that Article 5 is probably the bastion of federalism in the United States Constitution, in that as you know, federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the states. So it's critical when this Constitution was drafted and ratified that division of power was maintained. As you know, there were a group of anti-federalists who were very opposed to the Constitution in the ratification process. And their concern was that there was too much power given to the federal government. I would submit to you today that if not for Article 5, the Constitution may well not have been ratified, but they were confident that in Article 5, it gave the states power to push back on federal power. Samuel Jones, who was a leading New York ratifier and a moderate anti-federalist, said, we didn't know when we ratified the Constitution if we gave the federal government too much power or too little, or we left the states too little power. So there was 2 modes of proposing amendments. One was given to states, one was given to federal government. The power given to states was simply a check on federal power. So real briefly, I'm just going to review with you the process that the framers went through to come to the final version of Article 5 that we have in our Constitution today, because I think it's insightful about the intent on maintaining federalism and state power in Article 5. The first draft of Article 5 was by the Virginia, came with the Virginia plan, and that article said this: resolved that provision ought to be made for amendments of the Articles of Union whenever it so shall seem necessary, and that assent of the national legislature ought not to be required. So the first version of Article 5 was the states would propose amendments, the national legislature would have nothing to do with it. It was entirely state-based. The next version, which came about in Article 9 in the second draft of the Constitution, it says, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states of the Union for an amendment to this Constitution, the legislature of the United States shall call a convention for that purpose. So in this case, the states would apply, the national legislature or Congress would call the convention, and the states would propose the amendment. So again, the only role that the national legislature had was in calling the convention for the states to propose amendments. The third draft that came about in September 10th of 1787 said the legislature of the United States, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem necessary, or on the application of 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states, shall propose amendments to the Constitution. So there was a strong problem with this third draft in that the anti-federalists, particularly Mason, was very alarmed about it because the only way to propose an amendment was through the national legislature. So he stood up and said, if this is the article that we're going to have, then it will leave no opportunity for the states to propose amendments, and then the federal government will become oppressive. It was kind of a duh moment for the whole entire assembly there, and they frankly agreed with Mason, and so they came up with the current draft of the final Article 5 in the Constitution. I want to read what Mason said in his notes on his copy of the September 10th federal Constitution. He said, if you don't have a process of state-based amendments, as we're talking about today, he said, this is a doctrine utterly subversive to the fundamental principles of the rights and liberties of the states. The point being here is that Mason, a leading anti-federalist who didn't sign the Constitution, was deeply concerned that if there was not a state-based process of proposing amendments, then the states would lose power and federalism would be lost, and ultimately you would have federal tyranny. I would submit to you today that that's close to where we are today, with 36 trillion of debt, 2 trillion annual deficit, half of which is interest on that debt service or debt. We're at the brink of losing our fiscal solvency. We have the federal government encroaching on every area of the reserve powers of the states. For example, the federal government's encroaching on our water, our air, our power, our wildlife, our water, everything that you can imagine. The federal government has encroached in the state powers. Unless the states push back through Article 5, we will lose our nation. We will lose our fiscal solvency, we will lose our liberties, and we will lose our rights. So I would encourage you to remember that Article 5 is the bastion of federalism. Without it, we will no longer have a country, and that's why we're here today, because there are many patriots in the room today who are deeply alarmed, regardless of whether they're supporting this resolution or not. They're all deeply alarmed about the state of our nation. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I appreciate a due pass on this resolution.
Thank you, Senator McGilvery. And again, we'll be fair to both proponents and opponents, so there will be one opponent allowed to speak outside of the time frame. So it is now 8:16, so we'll start with proponents. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. I'm Sharon Jensen, Jensen from Billings, and I am a COS volunteer. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Convention of State Resolution HJ5 today. I would like to address one of the tenets of the resolution, and that's fiscal constraints. Our federal government has now accumulated over $36 trillion of national debt. We are accumulating approximately $1 trillion of new debt every 3 to 4 months. At the current rate, our debt will be over $50 trillion in 5 short years. At the end of the fiscal year, it is estimated that The debt alone will be the largest line item in our budget, larger than Social Security, Medicare, or certainly defense spending. Our last full fiscal year financial data that's available is 2023. In that year, we collected 4.4 trillion of revenue. We spent 6.1 trillion of total expenditures, a deficit spending of 1.7 trillion. Mandatory spending of that accounted for 3.8 trillion of the total expenditures. That includes Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlement programs. If you add the interest payment onto the mandatory spending, the total combined outlay is 100% of revenue. So all of the 1.7 trillion of deficit or discretionary spending was done by borrowing money. This fiscal year is estimated that the interest on the debt will eclipse 1 trillion. The picture becomes even more dire when you consider that the federal government does not include unfunded liabilities in the numbers that they present to the public. Unfunded liability for Social Security alone is estimated to be approximately 73 trillion. Now, it doesn't take a mathematician to understand that accumulation of debt of this magnitude is not sustainable and will lead to a collapse, economic collapse. The fiscal restraint amendment of the resolution is broader than just a balanced budget, but it includes a balanced budget. A balanced budget alone will not necessarily restrain spending because Congress can easily raise taxes to balance their budget. You have the power to step in and stop this madness, or we can continue to watch a runaway federal government implode our fiscal house. Members of this body can support the resolution HJ5 by calling for a convention of states that is strictly limited to proposing spending restraints and federal government overreach. This is your chance to do something on an issue of dire consequence, and I would ask that you support HJ5 by voting yes. Thank you for the opportunity. And Mr. Chair, I may need to leave early to testify on another bill with your permission.
That's fine. Thank you, Ms. Jensen. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chair, my name is Stan Riedman, last name spelled R-I-E-D-M-A-N-N. I'm from Great Falls, House District 19. I've been working as a volunteer for a convention of states for the last couple years. Working at the fair in Great Falls last 2 years, gun shows, car shows, the Choke Cherry Festival in Lewistown. I've spoken to, I'm sure, several hundred folks in that time. One question that comes up a lot is, what's the political breakdown of this Convention of States action? And I let people know that basically we're nonpartisan and non-ideological. So we want support from every political stripe across the spectrum. And to buttress that, I always point out a poll that was taken by the Trafalgar Group a couple years ago. And in fact, in that poll that they conducted, it was 1,078 likely election voters. And they asked the question, quote, would you support a convention of states to meet and propose constitutional amendments focusing on term limits for Congress and federal officials, federal spending restraints, and limiting the federal government to its constitutionally mandated authority, unquote. And the findings were about 2/3 of all these voters, the poll respondents said in the affirmative. And it was broken down basically by 81% Republican, 63% independent, and a narrow majority, but 50.2% of Democrats also agreed with that. So there's broad-based support, and some of that breakdown, you know, it was a little more contentious maybe along term limits, but where people really agreed and we had the broad-based support was in the fiscal area of fiscal restraint. people have a sense, because people would always relate what's happening with the federal government's fiscal mismanagement under both Republican and Democratic administrations to their own financial management, their own personal financial management. And they realize intuitively that what's going on with the federal government can't continue indefinitely. At some point, the federal credit card is going to get maxed out. They don't know how exactly that's going to be manifested, but they know it's not good. So that's the bigger area of concern. And in the other area of the federal government and its overreach, people have noticed with the accumulation and continued expansion of the government, people are becoming fearful, and along with cultural pressures over the last probably 10 years, people are afraid to speak up on certain issues. And it's that fear, the basis of our government really is we're a small r Republican form of government, but free speech is the basis of our government. And when people are afraid to speak up and express their opinion, no matter how unpopular, as long as it doesn't involve violence, then, our republic, I think, is having problems. So I would ask, basically, if the committee could pass House Joint Resolution out of committee, take it to the floor, we'll have further debate and discussion, which I think will be healthy for our republic. So I would ask that you pass this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reedman. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chair, Representatives, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Paul McElroy, MC capital E LROY. I am a local pastor in town. And as you just heard from the last speaker, this crosses political lines. Let me give you an example. About 5 years ago during a holiday, I had one of the ladies in our church, her son, who was on the far opposite side political of me, was visiting from another part of Montana at our church, and I brought up balancing the budget, and I said that the borrower is slave to the lender, as the Bible says, and I said we need a balanced budget. And I found out about a week later that he leaned over to his mom at that time and goes, "I love your pastor." So this crosses political lines, and I want to address the dynamic of convention of states and how we can bring our budget back in order. The bond market is showing great concern about our $2 trillion annual deficit and the $36 trillion national debt. Whether we like it or not, bond traders understand that debt cannot keep growing without a plan to repay it, because they are in the business of getting repaid. When we were here 2 years ago for Convention of States, the U.S. debt was just a little over $31 trillion. At this rate, it will exceed $50 trillion in just 5 years. By the end of this decade, interest on the debt will become the largest line item in the federal budget, surpassing Social Security, Medicare, and even defense. It will be almost equal to the total amount we pay in income taxes. To put it in perspective, 1 trillion is 1,000 billion or a million. This is the one that sinks home with me. 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. We are now adding $1 trillion in our debt every 100 days. Again, we are now adding $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. You have the power to stop this madness. By supporting a convention of states, you can help propose amendments to limit federal spending and overreach, or you can continue to watch as the federal government's fiscal irresponsibilities leads to our collapse. In our lifetime, Congress has rejected the balanced budget amendment over 100 times, and it's not going to change anytime soon. With 19 states on board, we are well on our way to reaching a majority to tackle this crisis. And Montana is uniquely positioned to keep the momentum going and help us get the ball over the goal line. We want members of this body to go and participate in a process that will propose amendments to rein in the federal government. We want well-crafted amendments from that convention to come back to this body for consideration and possible ratification. This is your chance. Let me say that again. This is your chance to act on this issue of great importance. Vote yes on this bill and help rein in the federal government's unchecked powers. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Pastor McElroy. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Joe Marullo, spelled M-A-R-U-L-L-O. I'm from Billings, Montana, and I am a COS volunteer. I have been engaged in collecting petitions in support of the COS effort, encouraging state legislators to pass the resolution requesting a meeting of states for the purpose of proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Members, your voters are fed up with the federal government and want change. When we explain the three tenets of the resolution and get to term limits, I have had people grab the clipboard from my hands and sign it immediately. People are sick of lifelong politicians, some of which have been in office over 47 years, longer than many members have been alive. Committee members, you have the responsibility under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to take action. I urge you to be on the right side of pursuing a Convention of States meeting by passing HJ 5 in support of the COS resolution and show the concerned citizens of Montana that you are listening to your voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marullo. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Eric Hogaug, H-O-G-H-A-U-G. I'm a volunteer. I live in Big Sky and in House District 60. The United States debt has grown from $908 billion in 1980, when Jimmy Carter was last president, to over $36 trillion, as you've already heard. Federal regulations continue to grow, and their intrusion into people's daily lives is unprecedented. Show me in the U.S. Constitution where we, the people, gave the federal government power to regulate how much water our washing machines use. Where is it? It's not there. Ronald Reagan said, quote, "Either you control your government or government will control you." His words were wise, but our founders were wiser. For they knew the federal government would grow even with the limits placed on it by the Constitution. They knew not when, but if the federal government grew too large, there was a way to amend. That power was left to the people. This power was left to you. How humbling is it to think that our founders thought about you when writing the Constitution? This mighty and moral power was given to you. It was left to ranchers. It was left to farmers. It was left to teachers. Again, it was left to you, citizens of this great country. The federal government does not derive its power from itself. The power of the federal government is given to it by we, the people. Now, we all have fire extinguishers in our homes. They're there for emergencies that we hope and pray will never visit our home. The extinguisher is there even though there are firemen just down the road, maybe just a few miles down the road. Now, many might say, don't attempt to put the fire out yourself. It may be dangerous. You don't know what could happen. Wait for the professionals to come. Well, my fellow citizens, our house is on fire. The firemen are not coming. It's time to pull out the fire extinguisher and fight this fire. It is time to act. If we continue to wait on the so-called professionals, our house, our country will be gone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hohaug. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Dan McLean, spelled M-A-C-L-E-A-N. I'm a volunteer with Convention of States. I live in Billings.
The recent federal election we've had has resulted in some promising prospects as far as cost cutting. However, we still have continuing resolution, reconciliation process, and the ever popular congressional earmarks. These structural issues have ballooned our debt to scary levels and compromised our ability to keep promises made generations ago. The runaway federal budget process must be reformed. A nonpartisan committee for a responsible federal budget reported late last year that Social Security is currently paying more benefits than it receives in payroll taxes. The program's trustees project that the trust fund reserves will be tapped out by the fourth quarter of 2033. By law, when the trust fund is depleted, Social Security can only pay out benefits equal to what it receives in payroll taxes. Think about that. According to the report, that means a mandated 21% per year across the board Social Security benefit cut for retirees starting in 2033. That's just over 8 years from now. When these real impacts hit, everyone in this room is going to feel it. It won't matter whose fault it is when it happens. It will be a genuine crisis with far-reaching impacts. Our fiscal house has to be put in order. I urge you to step into this process to address the congressional malfeasance by participating in making real changes to the federal budget process. By passing this resolution, you can look your constituents in the eye and say, I'm doing something about the fiscal calamity that's brewing. You'll be supporting an amendments proposing convention of the states that finally allows us to bypass the Congress, the lobbyists, and the special interests. Fiscal sanity is the only way to keep our promises. I thank the chairman and the committee for letting me speak. Please support HJ 5.
Thank you, Mr. McLean. Next proponent, please.
My name is David Plourde, P-L-O-U-R-D-E. I'm from Billings. I'm a supporter of the Convention of States, and my testimony is in support of the Convention of States to protect the Supreme Court. Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm here to highlight the danger of not holding a Convention of States, to propose an amendment setting the number of Supreme Court members. Without action, our administration could undermine the court's independence, packing it with justices aligned with their political agenda, threatening our rights and freedoms. The Constitution doesn't specify the number of justices. While 9 has been the standard since 1869, it's only traditional, not a law. This means that any administration with control of Congress and the presidency could expand the court to secure rulings in their favor. Court packing isn't a hypothetical. It's been openly discussed as recently. Here's why this matters. In 2008, Supreme Court narrowly affirmed the individual right to bear arms in District of Columbia versus Heller. That decision, protecting the Second Amendment from being interpreted as applying to state militias, passed with just one vote. Now, imagine the future where a packed court is no longer bound by the constitutional principles by a political loyalty. A political engineering majority could overturn precedents like Heller to gut the Second Amendment. This threat extends beyond gun rights. Any constitutional liberty, free speech, religious freedom, and due process could erode by a court beholden to the political whims of a majority party. A convention of states is the only realistic way to address this issue. Congress will never voluntarily limit their own powers or restrict its ability to manipulate the judiciary. It's up to the states, through the Article 5, to step in and preserve the balance of power. We must act now. Convention of States offers a lawful and peaceful way to protect our republic and ensure the Supreme Court remains the guardian of our Constitution. Thank you, and I ask for your support in HJ 5.
Thank you, sir. Next proponent.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I'm Stu Goodner. I serve as the chair of the Jefferson County Republican Central Committee.
Can you spell your last name, please?
Goodner, Goodner.
Thank you.
We recently passed a resolution supporting HJ5 legislation. I also serve as chair of Region 3 of the Montana County Republican Central Committees, and therefore I'm a member of the Montana GOP executive team. Last session, when we were talking about this, a gentleman testified we didn't need a balanced budget since the government could print money at will. He got exactly what he wanted. The last 2 years, federal spending increased over $1 trillion per quarter, and the supply of currency by $105 billion. We saw this at the grocery stores, runaway inflation. Someone else suggested different wording was used, not in the Constitution itself, but in conversations about Article 5. Somehow a 238-year-old grammatical error invalidated the whole concept of Convention of States for today. Another implied if this convention worked that other ones were planned to take on other issues. This is probably the first time that I've heard that the opportunity for success and meaningful change is a good reason not to do something. I want to spend the rest of my time addressing the argument we've never had one of these who knows what could happen, or basically fear of the unknown. In short, the simple answer is that you, the legislature, makes the unknown known. You define the scope of work for a convention of states and marching order to the delegates. Setting that aside, what if fear of the unknown dictated how we lived? For sure, we wouldn't have gone out into hell in the traffic today, yet it seems like we did. The space program wouldn't have happened if our fears outweighed the desire for achievement, knowledge, and exploration. We never would have fought the Civil War to end slavery and see all people as equal. We wouldn't be sitting in Lewis and Clark County right now because they never would have left St. Louis. Finally, the Declaration of Independence and Constitution would never have been written if our founding fathers would have been paralyzed by fear of the unknown. Rosa Parks once said, "I've learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear." I advocate that what must be done is take back the authority usurped by the federal government through constitutional term limits and a balanced budget, just as it is in our Montana Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodner. We're now 1/3 of the way through the proponent's time. Next proponent, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. My name is Karen Hogaug. It's Hoghaug, and I live in Big Sky. I'm a retired attorney, and I taught U.S. government at the high school and collegiate level for over a decade. I am an ardent supporter of a convention of states. Today, I'd like to address 5 guardrails or checks that will keep the amendment process within the scope of the topics outlined in the application. These will prevent any so-called runaway convention from resulting in radical amendments that are outside of that scope. Number 1, Montana, each state controls their own delegates and gives them the authority. Each state directs their delegates, and then they can impose penalties for unfaithful delegates. If Montana's delegation were to consider something outside of the scope of the topics that were approved, serious consequences could result. In fact, today there's a bill being considered on the Senate side that would impose those restrictions on any unfaithful delegates. 2, at the convention, if a convention were held, any delegate who proposed something that was outside of the scope of those 3 topics, any other delegate could call a point of order and that proposal would fail. 3, in order to make it out of the convention as a proposed amendment, 26 state delegations would need to approve any proposed amendment. 4, 38 states Okay, you heard Representative Clacken mention 38 states are needed to actually ratify any amendment. As you know, 38 states it's like herding cats, right? To get 38 states to approve anything is a high burden. And number 5, if any amendment were proposed that were outside of the scope of those 3 topics, lawsuits could be filed by state attorneys general, and the Supreme Court would find that that amendment failed because it was outside of the scope of the authority that was given to the convention. All of these checks create a very high bar for any amendment to meet to be properly ratified. To think that every single one of them would fail and we would end up with something crazy like repealing the First Amendment is a little bit absurd, especially when you've heard the consequences of what happens if we fail to act. Our federal government has far exceeded the authority given to it in the Constitution. According to the Declaration of Independence, when a government has engaged in a long train of abuses and usurpations, it is not only the people's right, it is their duty to overthrow such government. We're not asking you today for such radical action as overthrowing our government. We're only asking that you, Montana legislators, act within the scope of your authority to prevent continuing abuses and usurpations to the people that you represent. Thank you so much, and I encourage your support for HJ5.
Thank you. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chair and committee, my name is Peggy Bates, B-A-T-E-S, from Thompson Falls, Montana. There are those who would say we have never held an Article 5 convention, therefore we have no idea what might happen at this convention. Actually, an Article 5 convention is a state convention, and we have historical records of many state conventions that have been held. And this is what we know about state conventions. 1, they call the convention under limited topics. Each state selects and instructs their own commissioners. 3, the states have equal representation at this convention. It is 1 state, 1 vote. And number 4, of the over 40 state conventions that we have records of, not one of them has run away. This is a safe process, and we can't depend on our federal Congress to propose the needful amendments. So I urge you to make Montana help us join the other states and support this bill. And Mr. Chairman, I have a list of conventions that we know of that have been held. Could I present this?
Yes, just hand it to the sergeant, please.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for your time in serving and all that you do on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bates. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Dave Douglas, D-O-U-G-L-A-S. I'm from Thompson Falls. I drove nearly 4 hours today to be here so I could speak with you all. I volunteered my time and covered my expenses because I believe a convention in states is critically important for the future of this nation. To provide insight, if one were to be held, nearly 2 years ago in Williamsburg, Virginia, delegates from 49 states participated in a simulation where they strongly debated the issues in the application before you today. The convention resulted in several proposals that included items such as term limits, protecting the Supreme Court from being packed, legal standing for states to challenge unfair federal actions, federal restraints, fiscal restraints, interstate commerce, balance of power between states and federal government, and limitations on federal land ownership and governance. Now, these are only highlights of the proposals, but hopefully you can see that you have the power to be able to overcome some of the most serious challenges we face today. And because COS is a bipartisan effort with strong support from both Democratic and Republican voters alike, it's important to note that any proposals from an officially convened convention would still require ratification by 38 states. The high threshold serves as a critical safeguard, ensuring broad bipartisan support and providing an additional check and balance to protect against partisan or extreme measures. Congress has failed time and time again to correct the issues previously stated, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So please, it's up to us, we the people, to use the tools provided by us, by the founding fathers to us, who had the insight to write Article 5 exactly for times like these. I urge you to support HJ 5 and let Article 5 save us all from an out-of-control federal government. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next proponent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee members, my name is Sandy Dunning. I live in Shepherd, Montana, and I've been a volunteer with Convention of States for a number of years now.
Can you spell your last name, please?
Yes, it's D as in dog, UNNING.
Thank you.
There are two amendment proposal pathways as defined in the language of Article 5. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes. The congressional pathway is the least restrictive. It's not limited to any topics or time restraints. Any proposed amendment requires 2/3 support in both houses of Congress to be sent to the states for ratification. In contrast, the Convention of States pathway presents a much higher bar. It requires the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states to pass a resolution to formally make an application for a Convention of States meeting. That means 34 states must call for a convention and agree on all the topics. The 34 individual resolutions must tightly aggregate. Only when 34 state legislatures have passed the same resolution can the call occur. The Convention of States for proposing amendments will be limited to the scope of the call as specified in the legislation passed by each of the 34 states. So far, 19 states have passed legislation for a convention to propose amendments, and they are strictly limited to 1, imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, 2, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and 3, imposing term limits on Congress and federal officials. We ask that you support the resolution and formally add Montana to the list. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Dunning. Next proponent.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Steve Spitzer, S-P-I-T-Z-E-R. I live in Shepherd, Montana. Mr. Chairman, some who oppose our bill are constantly talking about runaway conventions and losing the Constitution. They must believe that our Constitution is not very durable. Yet in spite of the abuses heaped on it by Congress, the courts, and the executive branch, our current Constitution has remained the supreme law of the land for 238 years and counting. Fortunately, critical parts of the Constitution are still revered and enforced. Examples of this are our most precious rights enshrined in the First and Second Amendments. The structure of our legislative branch and courts follow the plan laid out in Articles 1 and 3 and subsequent amendments. No president has attempted to serve more than 2 terms since the ratification of the 22nd Amendment 74 years ago. By virtue of the 19th Amendment, women have been voting for 105 years. These facts and many others like them make us scratch our heads a little when we hear opponents fearmonger about runaway conventions. Why is using the second half of Article 5 to amend the Constitution so dangerous, we might ask? The answer is it's not. The framers put the second half of Article 5 in for a very specific purpose. It was another one of their brilliant checks and balances. It's remarkable and unfortunate that we have not used it yet. The provision before you today allows the states to gather for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution related solely to term limits, fiscal responsibility, and reduction in the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government. By the framers' design, it's a means to bypass an arrogant and out-of-control federal government. Nothing coming out of that amendments convention can become part of our Constitution unless the legislatures of 38 states, 38, vote yes. Put another way, 13 states can scrap anything that the Constitutional Convention would propose. This difficulty in proposing and ratifying amendments is part of the brilliant and durable design of our Constitution. I humbly ask, please support HJ5. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Spitzer. Next proponent, please. And we're about half done, and we have 11 folks online that want to testify, so please don't repeat testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Betty Jo Starr, S-T-A-R-R. I am a COS volunteer from Helena, Montana, House District 82. Many who oppose the Convention of States resolution are offering nullification as an alternative. Nullification is the legal theory that the U.S. states can refuse to comply with federal laws or executive orders that they deem to be unconstitutional. Nullification is an opportunity that not only presents itself when laws and executive orders are enacted that have an impact on we the citizens of Montana and are enforceable in some manner. Federally funded unconstitutional laws and executive decrees are intentionally difficult for states to nullify because typically they come attached with federal funding. The Affordable Care Act is a prime example. Despite the Supreme Court and Justice Roberts rewriting the law to save it from being ruled unconstitutional, the states still had their opportunities to nullify the ACA. The accompanying federal funds, heavily loaded in the early years, made it very appealing and very difficult for states to choose nullification. The reality is that needed structural and foundational changes, such as fiscal restraints or term limits on federal officials, do not present themselves to the states in a form that allows nullification to come into play. When has the federal government ever presented to the Montana legislature an omnibus spending bill or a continuing budget resolution that has contributed to the $36 trillion national debt? The answer is never, and there is no requirement to do so. So how can nullification address this? The reality is that it can't. The same is true of term limits on Congress, a position that regularly polls over 80% nationally. Common sense of history have shown us that Congress will never limit its power in areas of fiscal restraint or term limits. Thankfully, the founders have provided a tool to use, Article 5. The Convention of States for proposing amendments is the last safe, nonviolent, and constitutional solution to fixing the foundational problems of our republic. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I would appreciate your support of HG5.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. Next proponent, please.
Chairman, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Terry Kramer. My last name is spelled K-R-A-M-E-R. I'm from Clancy, Montana. In March of 1785, the states of Maryland and Virginia held a convention of states at Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. At the time, they were lacking a strong central federal government, but in post-revolution, the states were quarreling amongst themselves. They were even establishing predatory regulations amongst themselves, tariffs, and separate currencies. Mount Vernon's initial purpose was to address trade, fishing, and navigation disputes between the two states of Maryland and Virginia. It soon became obvious to the attendees that it was the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation that were really the top issue. This resulted in the call for the Annapolis Convention, which happened in the fall of 1786, 1 year before the Constitutional Convention. 13 states were invited to Annapolis. However, only 5 attended, so they didn't have a quorum. They discussed the matters amongst themselves and decided that they needed to call the meeting in Philadelphia on the second Monday in May of 1787. That is what we now consider the Constitutional Convention. The states of Virginia and the states of New Jersey accepted, reissued the Annapolis call, and with even broader authority. And by February of the 1787, there were 7 states that had accepted this call. The conclusion of the Annapolis Convention gave us the familiar language used by 10 of the 12 state commissions that accepted the invite to Philadelphia. And it reads, quote, "To take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union." You can see the broadness of the call. However, on May 13th, in 1787, 3 months before excuse me, on May 13th of 1787, we had 55 commissioners from 12 states who met in Philadelphia for that convention of states, which we call the convention, the Constitutional Convention. But backing up 3 months prior to Philadelphia, the Congress released an opinion that the Philadelphia Convention should be limited to the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, report to Congress. That was just an opinion. It wasn't a formal act. So I have heard our opponents falsely claim that the Philadelphia Convention was a runaway because Congress had issued this opinion, drawing the conclusion that all Article 5 convention states will also follow Philadelphia and also run away. This is not supported by the facts. In conclusion, the historical record and the sequence of events show that the Philadelphia Convention was long in the works before Congress put their nose in the wind and issued their opinion. Philadelphia was not a runaway. The call of the convention was broad enough to either amend or to replace the Articles of Confederation. It is time to bury this false narrative. And with that, I thank you for your attention and
thank you.
Please pass HJ 5.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Next proponent, please.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, sorry. My name is Jacob Emrich, E-M-R-I-C-A-H, as COS volunteer from House District 26 in Great Falls. Those who oppose an Article 5 convention of the states oppose it out of fear. Fear of a runaway convention or fear of getting rid of the Constitution altogether. What I am afraid of is a DOJ that completely politicizes and acts on the behest of one party. A DOJ that would spy and encourage prosecution of parents who disagree with what their children are being taught in public school. A president and his aides that only allow government-approved fact-check propaganda to be presented to the public. I'm afraid of a Federal Reserve that prints unending trillions of dollars out of thin air, and a vengeful DC bureaucrats accumulating power to force citizens to take an experimental drug in order to serve in the military or hold certain jobs. As you know, these are not imaginary fears. While we sit here and listen to our opponents fear-mongering about things that might happen, our Constitution is under assault. To the opponents of this resolution, I ask, what are you not afraid of about the reality that surrounds you today? While we're dealing with preposterous arguments about a runaway convention, the circle of liberty is growing smaller as our treasury is being looted. We are less free and less prosperous because a nanny state will not allow us to make our own decisions and live our own lives. We cannot develop energy, build pipelines, develop natural resources, and provide jobs to our citizens because a small group of elites in the deep state impose their will. The feds think that they have the authority to shut down our economy for whatever crisis they declare. And tell me again, what is so scary about COS? Start being scared about what's real and right here in front of your eyes. Only you, acting in your constitutional role, can save this country. A convention of states meeting is not a dangerous or a crackpot idea. It is in the mainstream of our constitutional governance. It is a tool right here in your toolbox for you to do your duty. Advance this resolution, please. When do you finally acknowledge enough is enough and agree to utilize the measure granted to you by the Founding Fathers in Article 5? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Bob Kohler, K-O-L-A-R. I'm from Helena. I'm a business owner and a citizen from HD 81. First, I would like to thank you for your service. You are the ones for very little pay that works for me, the average citizen. Mr. Chairman, I would like to speak to the power of fear. A great president once said, the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. Our forefathers in setting up our Constitution gave us a solution to the government out of control. It is Article 5 of our Constitution. I've been working on this project for nearly 12 years. Make no mistake, this will pass. The momentum is huge across the country, is gaining momentum day by day, week by week, year by year. The question is, will Montana be a part of the solution? Opponents to HJ5 have a simple strategy for stopping the passage of HJ5. They plan on imparting the emotions of fear rather than embracing objectivity. They preach fear and doom and gloom. You guys and gals in this body are smart enough to see through that. They cast doubt on the process of inserting fear of the COS morphing or replacing the U.S. Constitution, fear that the U.S. Congress will commandeer the COS to control the results, fear that the COS will wander off topic with unpredictable results, fear that Montana will not have equal influence and equal vote, and fear of change. The false fear narrative pushed by the HJ5 opponents have no historical precedence. Fear is an easy sell to people with limited historical knowledge and strikes an emotional response. Fear paralyzes. What is a possible consequence of giving in to fear and not doing anything? I hear every day from people that I talk with in my business that fear is what is happening in Washington if not changed or stopped, that we will find ourselves in a civil war. I even had a well-known doctor's wife speaking of a civil war, and it shocked me the other day. David Horowitz spoke in his book, Final Battle, and I quote, "America's on the brink of another civil war," end quote. On the other hand, we are the proponents of using Article 5 have a much more difficult strategy for passage of HJ5. Proponents must educate, and education perpetuates knowledge and understanding, which calms fears. In closing, I ask you to put aside the unsubstantial fears, if you have any. Step up to the leadership role that the founders provided under Article 5. Make Montana the next state to pass HJ5, and let's reverse the craziness inflicted by the federal deep state. Do this for the sake of our children, grandchildren, all Montanans. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kohler. Next proponent.
My name is Steve Allen, A-L-L-E-N. Mr. Chairman and committee members, one of the most ardent detractors of the Article 5 Convention of States process is the John Birch Society, whose mission statement declares, "Our mission is to bring about less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world by providing leadership, education, and organized volunteer action in accordance with moral and constitutional principles." Their website also states, "For over 60 years, the John Birch Society has been the force that protects and restores American liberty and independence." If they've been at this for over 60 years and their mission is to bring about less government, then how come Washington, D.C. has grown exponentially over that 60 years? And why is our national debt at over $36 trillion? However admirable the Birch Society mission statement may sound, I ask myself, after over 60 years of their effort, has it worked? The answer, not very good. Their efforts have not produced the desired goal of their mission statement, and in over 60 years, and things are getting worse every single day. Given that fact, I say it's time to use the method given to us by Article 5 under the Convention of States suggestion that was given to us by the founders of our great country. We urge you to rely on your skills as state legislators to objectively evaluate the impact of the John Birch Society, what it has had on achieving their mission, and to get in the driver's seat today using the language of Article 5 and get back our country and turn it around as our founders provided. I really highly suggest that you support HJ5. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next proponent.
Good morning, Chairman and Buttry and committee members. I'm Joe Hushek. Last name is spelled H-O-S-E-C-K. I'm from Great Falls. I'm a member of House District 24. I'm going to keep this short because I think everything I have here has already been said in one way, shape, or form. There's just one statement I'm going to say. As Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. We've done nothing long enough. Let's get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hosek. Next proponent.
I'm Lorelei Cavilier, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Trout Creek. Cavilier is spelled Cuvillaier. Thank you for allowing us to speak on this matter. We sit on the edge of the fall of our nation with this massive debt and bloated government. Both parties are responsible for this massive unconstitutional spending. It's going to take both parties to correct this within each state. We have too many 70, 80, 90-year-old legislators up in D.C. right now. We had a senator die who had to be wheeled out each time to vote. We have another senator who's hit the floor several times now. We had another senator who's going to be pushing 100 years old when he runs for his next term. And it was also revealed that a congresswoman has been in a dementia facility for the last 6 months that no one in her district knew. Both houses on both sides have too many people that have been in office 30, 40, and even 50 years, and they should be retired. The power of incumbency must be broken. We need fresh faces and fresh ideas. Our nation sits with the tools to fix these problems. Our founders knew the states would need this power. That's why they gave it to each and every one of the states. The states created the federal government. Therefore, it's going to take the states to correct it. This is why they put the correction method in the Article 5 of the Constitution. Cowardliness is contagious. You've heard about the fear tactics being used against this method, but it's been disproven time and time again by history and by the words within the Constitution itself. We have so many politicians who are career politicians by multiple decades and have become multiple millionaires. Voting them out just isn't working. We must place in term limits, good, bad, or indifferent. We need a serious house cleaning. Courage is equally or more contagious as well. Our founding fathers showed courage in the face of the world's most powerful army at the time. States have been shirking their duties for far too long, and it's way past time for you to stand up to the tyrannical federal government and regain your constitutional role. Once again, be courageous. I've deployed to war 3 times. Was I scared? Obviously. But I raised my hand and deployed. Last Friday marked 34 years since Desert Storm. I volunteered to go. Why? Because it was my duty. You guys each have a duty here today. A major piece of the current president's administration is the reduction of the bloated federal government. There is a mandate voted by 76 million voters in this country to fulfill here. We stand here today in one voice for you to help reduce the size and scope of this federal government by passing the Convention of States. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Seeing no
I'm
further.
the one you want to see. I'm the last one.
Yep. No further proponents in the room. We'll allow half of an hour or a half hour for the online proponents. Please make sure if your hand's raised, you are a proponent, not an opponent. We'll ask for opponents later. Let's start with Mr. Mike Ferris, please.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Michael Ferris. Well, my last name is spelled F-A-R-R-I-S. I'm an attorney. I'm the co-founder of the Convention of States Project. I've been in practice now for almost 48 years, and the vast majority of that time has been doing constitutional litigation. I've argued 2 cases in the Supreme Court of the United States, and I'm one of the few lawyers who's ever litigated an Article 5 case, and that's germane to what we're talking about here today, obviously. I represented Washington state legislators back in the late 70s on into the early 80s in litigation over the attempt by Congress to change the rules of the process of ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. Originally, Congress gave 7 years for ratification of the ERA, but deep into that process, they tried to add on another 3.5 years for that ratification. That case went to federal court in Idaho. There were 3 states working together, Idaho, Arizona, and Washington state legislators. The outcome of that was to rule that it was unconstitutional to change the rules in the middle of the stream. The case went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court sat on it until the second deadline passed, and then ruled the case was moot because the second deadline had passed. Recently, a number of states have tried to reinvigorate the ERA, and every court touching it in recent years, including the DC Circuit Court, has ruled that you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. And so this principle, you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream, has been ratified by a case that I helped litigate multiple times, including very recently in the DC Circuit. This is important because there are 450 applications for a convention of states right now. 49 states have applied for convention of states over the history of our country. We've never had a convention because we've never had 34 or 2/3 agree on the topic. Agreeing on the topic is absolute requirement to call the convention. It's not just 34 states asking for anything. It's 34 states asking for the same thing. So when you start with the principle that 34 states have to ask for the same thing, and you add to that the rule, you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream, we have established precedent that says the process requires an agreement on the topic, and you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. By the way, I'd like to commend the volunteers that have preceded me. I have testified in more than 20 state legislatures on the Convention of the States. And I've heard many, many, many presentations. The group that you've had in front of you is the best presentation I've ever heard, and very, very thorough, and it leaves me with not nearly as much ground to cover as I need to do normally. The one other thing I would like to tell you is that one of the excellent volunteers gave you the basics of why the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was not a runaway. His statements were all accurate. If you want all the details, his talk, I'm pretty sure, was based on an article that I wrote for the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy that's published online, free and available to anyone. If you put my last name in, Farris, F-A-R-R-I-S, and the phrase defying conventional wisdom, you can get the extensive article that gives you all the details of why our Constitution was not a runaway convention. People calling themselves a constitutionalist and then saying that our Constitution was a runaway convention, to me, it's like saying, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, but I don't really believe the Bible is the Word of God. Yeah, you can't do it both ways. If you're a Bible-believing Christian, you got to believe in the Bible. If you're a constitutionalist, you got to believe in the legality of the Constitution. If it was adopted by an illegal runaway convention, what you're saying is it was illegal. Ladies and gentlemen, it's just not true. And I think we all ought to stand up for the legality and the legitimacy of the Constitution and understand our history correctly. Finally, I would just simply say the founders of the John Birch Society used to agree with me. They proposed an amendment called the Liberty Amendment. It was really a pretty good amendment back in the late 50s and early 60s. I testified in the Wyoming legislature by this same method yesterday, and pointed out that in 1959, the John Birch Society appeared before the Wyoming legislature advocating for a convention of states for the Liberty Amendment, and the Wyoming legislature passed it in 1959. The John Birch Society's first president and second president supported a convention of states. So when the current John Birch Society tells you it's dangerous, they're not only telling you that George Mason and the founders are wrong, they're telling you that the founders of the John Birch Society were wrong and didn't know what they were doing. And so, the history of our country stands on the side of voting yes on this measure. And the history of the John Birch Society itself stands on voting yes on this measure. So with that, Mr. Chairman, since I am, the co-founder and a constitutional expert on these subjects, if it is permissible by your rules, I'd be happy to answer any questions that any member has.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. We'll have questions at the end of testimony. We'll now go to the next online proponent, Doug Carey.
Thank you, Chairman Buttrey, committee members. I'm Doug Carey. Last name is spelled K-A-R-Y, and I'm a constituent of House District 39. I'm proud to support this call for a convention of states, number one. Number two, I'm going to scrap half of my testimony because lots and lots of stuff have been covered and you don't need to hear it again. I want to start out with, you may hear from opponents today referring to the Convention of States as a con-con, a John Birch Society made-up word to persuade individuals. Con-con means, in their language, constitutional convention. This is not a constitutional convention. This is an Article 5 convention of the states. Con, by definition, used as a verb, is to persuade someone to do or believe something, typically by deception. It can also be used as a noun, such as an instance of deceiving or tricking someone. So that would lead most of us to presume that con-con means persuasion through deception, implying that delegates can process more than what's outlined in this resolution is really akin to saying that legislators, such as you are, can legislate the judicial and executive branches out of existence. Impossible. You can hear from it, you may hear today from individuals as opponents and other individuals claiming to be constitutional experts. Now, what makes them an expert? Do they have degrees from accredited law schools, or do they just have ties with the John Birch Society? Does appearing before state legislators or being a guest on a radio and television show make that person an expert witness? Absolutely not. Otherwise, everyone that testified this morning is an expert witness. Anyone can buy a book on how to become a constitutional expert. Just look it up. A plumber, a doctor, and numerous other professionals. I'm a firm believer in our First Amendment rights, but not to utilize freedom of speech to mislead state legislators on matters of law and policy under false credentials. Opponents claim that unanswered questions cloud the Convention of States. Senate Bill 120 that'll be heard this afternoon will resolve all those questions. I'm fairly certain of that. Working through the Montana State Legislature is the only way that we, the people, can restore constitutional government. 36 trillion in debt means we must act now. I'm proud to support this call for Convention of States, and I ask you to please support this joint resolution. Thank you, Chairman Buttry, for the time, and committee members.
Thank you, Senator Kerry. We'll go to our next online proponent, Kathy Krupp.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kathy Krupp, and that's spelled K-R-O-O-P. I live in Billings, Montana, and I'm part of House District 42. Representative Fitzgerald and Senator Lamers are my representative legislators. There are 127 Convention of State action petition signers in my district. And to keep it short, I urge you to vote yes on the Convention of States Resolution HJ5. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Krupp. Next proponent, Mark Sabin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good morning. My name is Mark Sabin. My name is spelled S-A-B as in Baker, I-N. I am a strong supporter of using the U.S. Constitution's Article 5 Convention of States to help rein in the tyrannical, non-responsive government that has existed for some time in this country. I will now explain why I support Article 5. The Founding Fathers were a unique assembly of highly intelligent, worldly wise men who fortuitously happened to coexist in a remote settlement far from much of the rest of the known world. These men understood history, they understood government, they understood human nature. They wrote the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution fully cognizant of the realities that faced human progress in that time. They were not so arrogant, however, as to believe that they were perfect or that they could foresee everything that would happen as the world changed in the future. Thus, they gave us a government of limited and enumerated powers with assurances written into a Bill of Rights to protect and guarantee those precious unalienable rights that their progeny would hopefully have the courage and fortitude to protect and defend well into a distant and unknown future. They also gave us Article 5 of the Constitution so that it could be amended as the country and the world developed and changes became necessary. Had we not had that capability, women and many minorities would still not have the right to vote. The founders were also wise and sufficiently prescient to know that as government grew, it would become less responsive and more tyrannical in its behavior. Rome and Britain were good examples. Thus, they gave us the Article 5 Convention of States to enable sovereign citizens of the country through their state governments to peacefully go around the existing federal government and thereby make necessary changes the government would not deign to impose on itself. We must not be the summertime soldiers of which Thomas Paine wrote in The American Crisis. We are in a time of many crises. We must demand accountability and performance from our government, and we must have the fortitude and courage to do what is necessary to turn this country around. The founding fathers gave us a powerful tool to use, the Article 5 Convention of States. Legislators, I ask you to summon the courage, have the conviction, have the foresight, and steel yourselves to persevere and see this through to a brighter and freer future. Approve HJ5 and let's get on with the task of reining in a wayward federal government and its unruly bureaucratic machine. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Sabin. We'll next go to TJ Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Buttry, committee members. I'd like to echo everything that's been said, to which I'd like to mention a historical fact about the power of the number 38. In the history of our nation, we've had approximately 2,000 proposed amendments to our Constitution, yet we only have 27. As you go through the rest this morning, remember that 27, only 27 out of 2,000. That's the power of the number 38. Chairman Buttry, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll now go to Bruce Hoyland.
Yes, Chairman. My name is Bruce Hoyland. I am Vice Chair of the Mushoe County Republican Central Committee, and we urge a due pass on HJ5. Thank you for hearing our testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyland. Oh boy, we're going to try this. Next, we're going to have Melissa Porcaro Hawkinson. And ma'am, you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Melissa Porcaro Hawkinson. It is PORCARO-HAAKENSON. Hello, Chairman and committee members. Thank you for allowing us to speak. I'm a volunteer with the Convention of States from District 14. Currently, we have somewhere around 352 residents from District 14 who have signed the petition for the Convention of States. I want to thank Dave, Peggy, and Laura Lee for traveling from our area and taking time from their busy schedule, and for Karen and Peggy both for explaining the purpose of the three main areas of the Convention of States, including term limits, fiscal restraints of our government, and imposition of scope, power, and judicial restraint on the federal government. I will keep this short. Being born and raised in Texas, I'm proud of my state for passing the Convention of State resolution. And I ask y'all to make me a proud, now resident and business owner residing in Montana and support HJ5. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next proponent, Scott Bollinger, please. Sir, you're on mute. Last chance. You're still on mute. Okay, Mr. Campbell, let's go to Tony Rosales, please.
Thank you, Chair Buttry and committee members. My name is Tony Rosales. I'm a resident of Great Falls, and I'm also the chair of the Cascade County Libertarian Party. few weeks ago, the Cascade County and also the Lewis and Clark County Libertarian Party has released a statement in support of this specific resolution calling for a convention of states. This demonstrates that Montana Libertarians believe the state of Montana should use every tool in its capacity to rein in the federal government, including nullification as supported by the 10th Amendment, as well as for calling for a convention of states through this resolution. I also coach speech and debate at our local high schools here in Great Falls. The current topic involves secession of other countries. Secession, as our own history has shown, usually results in violence of brother against brother. In today's discourse, secession and civil war is a common discussion topic by many across the political spectrum. We need a convention of states to exhaust every diplomatic method to ease the current political divides. In the worst case scenario, a convention of states would simply be a national conversation that is led by the states as opposed to the federal government. I urge every committee member here to vote in favor of HJ5. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosales. Next, Darlis Nordhagen. And you're on mute. Last chance you're still on mute. There you go.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Darlis Nordhagen, Nordhagen. I ranch in Opheim and live in Glasgow. I'm part of House District number 29. Representative Valerie Moore and Senator Greg Hunter are my representative legislators. There are 238 Convention of States action petition signers in my district, and they and I all urge you to vote yes on Convention of States Resolution HJ5. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nordhagen. I'm not showing any more online proponents, but we do have Diane Wyrick signed up, and I see she's on there. Ms. Wyrick, are you a proponent? If so, please raise your hand. Okay, let's go to Diane Wyrick, please. And you're on mute. Still on mute. Okay, looks like we have a few others. Let's go to Mike Vondra, please, Mr. Campbell.
Hi there. My name is Mike Vondra. I'm a resident of Billings. I won't belabor the point here, but I'm in support of Article 5 and the tenets of the Convention of States. I'm a financial planner here in Billings with Edward Jones. And, you know, folks, I sit every day with families that are concerned. Not just about themselves, because most of my clients have worked hard and positioned themselves well, but they're concerned about their kids and their grandkids. You know, balancing the budget, limiting the federal government, setting term limits, these are all very reasonable things. And I believe to be very wise and at the heartbeat of this great country and what the founding fathers set off for a long time ago. I think at stake, we've got our values, our economics and finances and stewardship, and honestly, our freedom. So thank you for serving the people of this great state, and I would urge you to please consider passing this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vondra. Last proponent will be John Cranston.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, thanks. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, esteemed committee members. My name is John Cranston, spelled C-R-A-N-S-T-O-N, although most folks know me as AJ. I live here in Hamilton. I've been a volunteer for COS for a couple of years now. I'd like to start by thanking those responsible for bringing this bill to bear. I'm here to encourage you to vote yes on HJ5. The call for Article 5 Convention of States to create constitutional amendments requiring a balanced budget, placing term limits on both houses of our federal legislatures, and reducing and or limiting the power of the federal government. We have to have a way of holding the people responsible for generating our national budget accountable. The way to do that is by making an annual budget balanced budget law, not merely passing yet another inflated continuing resolution, giving money away to special interests in foreign countries, but actually generating a unique, fiscally prudent annual budget that benefits the American people before all others. If we continue to accrue debt at the rate we have been, this nation will financially implode and no longer be able to function. We cannot continue to look the other way while billions of our tax dollars go unaccounted for. Term limits, we here in Montana have believed the term limits are necessary for 23 years. 22 other states share in that belief. It's long past time that our federal legislatures in both houses are held to that same standard. Our founding fathers never intended politics to be a lifelong career, yet we have far too many senators and congresspeople that have never held any other job other than politics. One should serve their nation, do the best they can with their time, then return to their civilian lives. That's the only way we can maintain fresh perspective and views instead of being mired in the same old quagmire. While the delineation of state authority and federal authority are both addressed in both Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, as well as the 10th Amendment, our federal government continues to take more and more power unto itself. We need some clarification in the 10th Amendment, as well as specific consequences for failure to adhere to these rules of governance. I believe we also need to limit the size of the federal government, as well as its ability for elected officials to appoint non-elected bureaucrats who do not serve at the will of we the people. I don't think the founders intended the federal government to be the largest employer in the country. During the government shutdown of 2013, over 850,000 non-essential employees were laid off. If they're not essential, why are they even on the payroll? This is just one example of the federal government being out of control. Again, I encourage you to vote yes on HJ5, adding the great state of Montana to the 19 other states, which have already passed a call for a convention, and moving us one step closer to returning our nation to a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cranston. We are now out of time for proponents. That was about an hour and 10 minutes, so we went a little bit over. And thank you to all the proponents. I think everyone did pretty well. Just as a reminder, some of you may not know the decorum rules we have. We do not allow the use of formal names, whether it's a person's name or a business name, so please don't do that in your testimony. And please try to avoid derogatory terms as much as you can. We did, since we ran out of time, we do have on the record Scott Bollinger and Diane Wyrick as proponents. They were having trouble online, but we will record them as proponents. Okay, we are now going to go to opponents, same time limit restrictions. Opponents, please, to Senate Joint Resolution 5.
Mr. Chair, excuse me,
Senator.
Mr. Chair, could we just pass this out? This needs to be passed out.
Yeah, you can. Thank you, Senator McGilvery. First opponent, please.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, my name is Ed Regan, R-E-G-A-N. I am the chairman of the Broadwater County Republican Central Committee. We are opposed to HJ5. In 2014, Supreme Court Justice Scalia warned, and I quote, "I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa, who knows what would come out of that," unquote. Again, in 2015, Scalia remarked, "A constitutional convention is a horrible idea. This is not a good century to write a constitution," unquote. The real purpose of SJ5 is to have Montana apply for a convention under Article 5 of the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, this resolution could result in an open convention where everything is on the table. Term limits and the other stated goals found in HJ5 are nothing more than the predicates to muster conservative support in red states. Our legislature has been rejecting these convention resolutions since the mid-1980s. Last session, the House overwhelmingly killed two similar resolutions in the committee and two blast motions on the floor, which 70% of the body opposed. Montana's only authority under Article 5 is to apply to Congress for a convention. Having received 34 valid applications, the Congress shall call the convention, not the states. Congress has the authority to pass implementing legislation. Despite claims made by proponents, we do not see language in Article 5 giving the states power beyond the application process. With the deep divisions in the country and in Congress, it's anybody's guess what that legislation might look like. Proponents claim they can control this whole process, yet they cannot point to clear and concise language in Article 5 to back up those claims. These statements are their unproven legal theories with no guarantees and no different than Dr. Fauci telling America to trust the science. The U.S. Constitution already limits the government with specific enumerated powers. Electing representatives who will remain faithful to their oath and to uphold the Constitution is the only real solution. The last thing our nation needs at this time in history is to be plunged into several years of constitutional confusion or crisis. Most of the world's economies and the freedom of Western civilization depends on our stability. The Broadwater Committee has submitted detailed written comments elaborating more of our reasons for opposition. I hope you'll have time to review them and to understand why there's Republicans out there that are opposed to this also. Your votes on these Article 5 convention calls and faithful delegate bills are extremely important. HJ 5, the vote is really about a convention, not the term limits or the other conservative issues listed in the caption. Convening a second constitutional convention may sound like a good idea. However, we believe it's no different than lighting a prescribed burn that ends up becoming a wildfire. We ask for a no vote on HJ 5, and thank you for your service to Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Reagan. If you're an online proponent, please raise your hand. And again, folks, please do not use people or businesses' names. Next opponent.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Noreen Freistadt, and the last name is spelled Freistadt. I live in Helena, and I'm a member of Northern Plains Resource Council, and I'm here today representing that organization. Broadly, we have no issues with the goal of a balanced federal budget, but we have real concerns about using a convention of states to amend the Constitution to achieve that goal. I'll briefly walk through some of these concerns. Even if this legislature limits the topics you'd like to see addressed in a convention, there is nothing in the Constitution to prevent a convention from being expanded to issues not raised in calls passed by state legislatures once convened. We think the threat of through this process is very real, and it could create an unpredictable Pandora's box. The application process itself is unclear. Many states have submitted applications calling for a convention of the states that are bonded to specific amendments, but there is no clear process for how Congress or some other governmental body would count and add up Article 5 applications. What if some of the applications are limited to amendments that relate to just the balanced budget, while others are limited to amendments that would undermine the Second Amendment? What is the mandate for a convention of states resulting from that combination of applications? Our country has an effective, successful process in place to amend the Constitution. It's been used 27 times since it was ratified in 1788. Our message here is not that the Constitution should be untouchable, but the Constitution is also the bedrock on which our fundamental freedoms and liberties as Americans rest. We do not want to meddle with those freedoms. Montanans are facing real crises that we can work together to solve here at the state level. The cost of housing, access to clean water, access to childcare, rising electricity rates, just to name a few. If it were up to me, I'd love to see you legislatures who represent me prioritize solving those issues and making the lives of Montanans materially better, not opening up a Pandora's box of changes to our Constitution. Please consider voting no on HJ 5. Thank you for this opportunity today.
Thank you. Next opponent, please.
Good morning, Chair Buttry, members of the committee, Keaton Sunchild, SUNCHILD. I am the Government and Political Relations Director for Western Native Voice. I did happen to go to a law school and sit in a lot of constitutional law classes, but I didn't need to show up at 8 a.m. all those mornings to know that this is a bad bill. For tribes, specifically for tribal sovereignty and the treaty rights that have been negotiated and been in place for generations. A constitutional convention would lead to a direct attack on those treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, and other protections for Native communities. The resolution tries to place constraints that the convention would be fiscally related, but that jeopardizes a lot of funding for programs that are vital for Native American communities, cuts programs that would disproportionately harm tribes who are already facing significant challenges from the economy, from society, generational trauma. And nowhere in the resolution does it mention consulting with tribes, including tribes, which to us is a direct attack on our rights and our tribal sovereignty. And for those reasons and the others said before me, we are in strong opposition to this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sunchild. Next opponent, please. Welcome, Representative.
Good morning, members of the committee. I'm Representative Kathy Love, House District 85, Hamilton, Corvallis, Darby, and Sula. So I've long been an opponent of the Convention of States. While I know that is in our Constitution, and I do know that our federal government is out of control, one of the things that I have never been able to resolve is that the only rules governing a Convention of States is in Article 5 itself. And so we hear a lot of claims about how this is going to go. I've heard that each state controls their delegates, but we have to ask ourselves, who chooses the delegates? Where is that in Article 5? How many delegates does each state get? Where is that in Article 5? If Congress chooses the mode of ratification as a convention, do they get to choose how the delegates are chosen? Do you trust the legislatures of 49 other states and Congress to do the right thing? Frankly, I'm not even sure some days I trust our legislature to do the right thing. I've heard that they can't propose anything that they weren't authorized by their state to propose. So California has passed SJR 7 to apply for a convention of states to put a ban on assault weapons in the Constitution. If California sends their delegates there for that reason, that is what they are proposing. Where in Article 5 does it say that the convention will be limited to certain topics? Because it does say in Article 5 amendments, plural. It doesn't say that the topics have to be limited. Where does it say that all the states that attend have to agree on these so-called limited subjects? If that were the case, then why are certain organizations trying to resurrect every application ever made since the 1800s, no matter the subject, in order to have the number needed to meet the threshold? We've heard that we've had many conventions of states, but the reality is we've had numerous conventions within states, but never a convention of all 50 states since the very first one that crafted our Constitution. So I think these are questions we all need to ask ourselves. And again, I challenge each of you to go back and read Article 5 and see if any of what claims line up and align with the directions in Article 5 itself. And for that reason, I'm in opposition to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Love. Next opponent, please, in the room. Opponent.
Thank you for being here to do this job. I know it's long. I'm Curtis Hughes from Laurel.
Can you spell your last name, please?
Hughes.
Thank you.
You've heard the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now it's time for truth check. I'm not the one to tell you that. This whole convention of states, Article 5 convention, CON, whatever it is, the idea is misleading because it does not solve the root of the problem. Our nation's drift toward tyranny is not because of any flaws in the Constitution, but because we are unfamiliar with it. We can't enforce what we don't know. Constitutional enforcement starts with the people, but every elected official swears an oath to uphold the Constitution. In the words of James Madison, this means that every legislator is duty-bound to interpose for the arresting of progressive of the evil. Jefferson observed, because it was the states who created the Constitution, they should have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction. Such action is not radical or unprecedented. States have said no to the federal action hundreds of times. This action can happen right now without any need for a long, arduous amendment process and without putting our Constitution at risk. The duty is yours to uphold the oath of office by defending and enforcing the Constitution and not changing it. I'd like to read a couple of the. Nowhere in the text of the Article 5 does it guarantee that voting at the convention will be based on one state, one vote. Absolutely nowhere in the text of the Article 5 does it say or guarantee that the convention can be limited to a single amendment. The support this measure has received, especially from those who are considered the very titans of conservatism, is astounding. It is further evidence that the desperation of the far right is every bit as unconservative as the disaffection of the far left. Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Next opponent.
Mr. Chair, if the chair would allow, I have a statement from former Representative Lola Sheldon Galloway.
Ms. Galloway is online.
Oh, she is?
Yeah,
Okay.
she'll have her say.
She had to turn around due to the snowstorm.
Yeah, we got her online. Any other opponents in the room? Seeing none. Oh, we have one more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Tom Millett. Last name is spelled M-I-L-L-E-T-T. I represent House District Number 2, which is Western Flathead County and Southern Lincoln County. I'm sure I haven't been in this room for very long, so I don't know what you've heard on the opponent side. I'm sure you've heard and read all the different things that the opponents would say. I want to give you a different take on this, give you something to think about when it comes to Article 5. And this comes to me not from something that I read per se, and I'm not repeating somebody else's stuff. It's just something that I've come to after doing a lot of critical thinking, and mainly from the founders also, especially our president, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. It is my contention that the only reason we should be using amendments to the Constitution is because there's a defect in the Constitution. To put it in layman's terms, I like to look at it as two problems. When you're looking at something like this, like we need to amend the Constitution, is it a problem with the Constitution? Is there a defect? Or is it a people problem? Because if we're trying to fix a people problem by amending the Constitution, it's going to fail. Let me give you an example. And I'll give you an example on two different sides of that, where there was a defect in the Constitution and we fixed it with an amendment, and there was a people problem and we tried to fix it, but it didn't. The fix didn't take. So back in 1919, we had a problem in this country. It was called alcohol. So the wise people back then, they decided to pass the 18th Amendment in 1919, which prohibited alcohol sales, the importation, the manufacture, and the sale of alcohol in the United States. So in 1919, they passed the 18th Amendment. And how did that work out for us? 14 years later, the 21st Amendment came along to repeal the 18th Amendment. Why was that? Because we tried to solve a people problem, alcoholism, by amending the Constitution. So that did not work. Let's go to the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment changed the Constitution so that that allowed the women the right of suffrage. Now, is that a defect in the Constitution or was that a people problem? I contend that was a defect in the Constitution because the Constitution only allowed males to vote. So we fixed it that way. That was a defect in the Constitution. Another one that was a defect in the Constitution was remedied by the 26th Amendment in 1971. And that amendment allowed the lowering of the voting age from 21 to 18. That's a defect in the Constitution. That's not a people problem. So those two amendments, just those two examples, the 19th Amendment, the 26th Amendment, fixed a defect in the Constitution, whereas the 19th Amendment did not fix that problem because that was a people problem. Now, I know there's three things that this proposed Convention of States amendment to go to a Convention of the States is trying to fix. It's a balanced budget problem, it's entrenched politicians, and it's also federal jurisdiction. I'll just cover it real quick. The balanced budget amendment, ask yourself, is that a people problem or is that a defect in the Constitution? I contend that's a people problem. If you want to fix a people problem, you change the people. The next one is term limits. If we have entrenched politicians, is that a people problem or is that a constitutional problem? Defect in the Constitution. I submit that it is a people problem and you just need to vote them out. We already have term limits. And the third one is federal jurisdiction. Is the federal beast getting outside of its cage? I think we can all agree, yes. How do you fix that? Well, it's called the 10th Amendment. We already have it's a people problem when you have federal employees and federal bureaucracy getting outside their guardrails. You need to fix the people problem. You don't fix it with a constitutional amendment. How do you fix that? Like I said, the 10th Amendment. The states have the power to rein in the federal government, believe it or not. I don't have a lot of time to go into the detail, but I'll just do a real quick shameless plug. I do have an amendment or a bill it's called the Montana Constitutional Sovereignty Act. And it's something that Utah did last year, and I want to bring it here to Montana, and I'm going to introduce it this session. And what that'll do is that'll give us the tool to put the federal beast back in the box. At least it's a start. So I would ask that you consider what I said very carefully. When you have a problem, is it a people problem or a constitutional problem? I submit these three problems that we're dealing with in this in this bill in front of you is a people problem, and we need to deal with the people problem, not mess with the Constitution. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee.
Thank you, Representative Millet. Seeing no other opponents in the room, we'll go to online proponents. Let's start with Lola Galloway, please.
Am I online?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I believe that a convention of states equals the same end result as a constitutional convention. You can call changing or adding to our Constitution what you may, but either way, the final result is we end up with a very dangerous constitutional convention ran by the very people we don't trust in Washington, D.C. Now, I have asked for several years for a copy of the required application that we would send to the U.S. Congress, and no one has been able to produce one for me. You may wonder why. I believe it's because the application is asking for Congress to have a constitutional convention to add these amendments. Even the very well-organized group pushing for the Convention of States website states a constitutional convention would be dangerous. The Convention of States keeps asking for the very amendments that Congress refuses to add to our Constitution by means of a congressional vote. Yet Congress gets to decide how the convention is ran. Why even ask for a convention? Let's talk about a few of these forced through Convention of States amendments. First idea, balanced budget. Montana requires a balanced budget in our state constitution, but it's just smoke and mirrors. Things we can't afford but want, we take out a loan or a bond, going into debt, paying it off with 10 to 20 years of payments with interest. But because the payments fall within the yearly budget, we consider that a balanced budget. That's smoke and mirrors. But until Montana starts refusing federal dollars and gets off the federal programs, the federal government will never get out of debt. Montana legislature should start here, not a convention. So it's hypocritical. Until you as the legislature can do that, voting for yes for this convention isn't going to work. The second amendment, term limits. Montana can't even honor the will of the people who thought they were voting for a maximum of 6-year limits. We have legislators who keep bouncing back and forth between the House and the Senate seats, some going on for 20 years. That's hypocritical. Where's our own term limits in Montana? Now let's talk about controlling other states who represent them at this convention and how the votes will go. If Congress, who is in charge, decides to do a popular vote, right now that's 435 votes in Congress, and that's how Congress is represented, Montana would only get 2 votes. Come up with your own scenarios, but the point is, if they get to decide, we don't get to decide. Who would go for Montana? Who would we send? Who gets to decide? Let's talk about controlling the convention rules and procedures. I've helped run many conventions and spent many hours making sure every rule and bylaw is followed. We've crossed every T and dotted every I in the credentialing process. One convention, 14 counties didn't qualify for representation to vote, yet in one motion from the floor and one vote invited them into the voting body. Every convention has the potential of overruling the rules and procedures. Legislators are allowed to do the above any day in the Montana legislature if they so choose. Remember the silver bullets in the 2017 session? From that, we got the Salish-Kootenai Water Compact. But my most important comments are this. This is a dangerous idea. Maybe honoring the Constitution better than we do is the real solution. I have faith in our newly elected president, President Trump, and who he will work with to get our country back on track. Don't spoil his chances by opening up a convention, opening up a constitution in this current corroded environment in Washington, D.C. I'm asking you to vote no. I want to go back one more thing to term limits. I want you to think this question on the federal level. If we term limited our senators, there would be a 6-year lame duck senators in Washington, D.C. That is a dangerous situation too. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Representative Sheldon Galloway. I had a question on the use of names, and I'll clarify a little bit more. If they're historical names, we're talking about a president, we're talking about Mason, then that's fine to use. But we don't want just normal people's names and business names. So just clarifying that. Thank you. All right, next online proponent. Let's go to Robert Brown, please. Opponent.
There, can you hear me this morning?
Yes.
Thank you so much for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I feel like this is probably the most important vote you'll be taking this session. This really is a pivotal moment, whether or not the United States will have a constitutional convention, Article 5 convention, convention of states, whatever they want to call it. I stand proudly with James Madison, who led the efforts to stop an Article 5 convention in his day. And I'll go into that in a little bit of detail here. But first of all, the Convention of States application for a convention has come up in almost every legislative session for more than a decade now in Montana, and it's been shot down every time. And I'd say for good reason. The question I pose to the group today is this: would you support a convention if it were being promoted as a convention where everything in the Constitution is subject to change, and that the convention would have the power to create their own ratification process? Would anyone here support that? And I think the answer generally is no. I've asked that question many times. Almost nobody would support a completely open convention that could write its own rules for ratification. But the reason I ask this is because that is the historical and legal precedent for a convention. This isn't just fear of the unknown. This is based on clear, irrefutable precedent. This is not a state convention that was claimed earlier. This is a unique Constitution amending convention, which we've only really had one other in our nation's history. So the only precedent we have for a convention of states is the Convention of States that was held in 1787. Yes, the 1787 Constitutional Convention was called a Convention of the States by the Founding Fathers, and it fit the definition that convention promoters are using today. Delegates were called as representatives of their respective states. They were given commissions that limited what changes they could propose. And they had a very strict, constitutionally defined ratification process. And they freely admitted they felt it was necessary to exceed those limits and to replace the ratification process with one of their own creation. The Convention of States organization makes claims about this historical precedent that I would refute. And so for the last 5 years, I've offered $1,000 reward to anyone who can provide evidence to support their claims of what happened in 1787. Specifically, you should have received a document that's called the $10,000 challenge, where it cites the Convention of States president and co-founder, Mark Meckler, where he claims that the majority of delegate commissions for the convention, quote, had this language in it: the commissioner has any and all authority necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies, urgent needs of the union. So these guys had all authority, ending his quote. Now, if that were true, that the delegates were given any and all authority, do you think that they would have known that? As you look into the document further, I have first challenge is find even one state commission that had that language in it, saying that the delegates had any and all authority necessary. Point number 2 in the $10,000 challenge is find one delegate who, when this issue came up and they were questioning whether they had the authority, find one delegate who stood in the convention and said, hey, look, right here, here's my commission. It says we have any and all authority. And lastly, show that that was why the delegates decided to move forward, that the majority of the convention delegates felt like, yes, we have the authority to make any changes we feel necessary, so let's proceed. But that didn't happen. And if anyone can find that history for me, I'm offering $10,000 because, of course, if Convention of States is telling the truth here, that should be easy to find. And on the document here, and for anyone listening as well, you're welcome to take the challenge. Submit that evidence to cosevidence@gmail.com. Now, convention promoters claim if the convention were to propose amendments that were outside the scope of their commission, all it would take is one delegate calling for a point of order to stop it. Yet that's exactly what happened repeatedly in 1787 Convention of States. Repeatedly, they raised such concerns like, for example, this comes from Madison's notes in the 1787 convention, where he says, General Pinckney expressed a doubt whether the act of Congress recommending the convention or the commissions of the deputies to it would authorize a discussion of a system founded on different principles from the federal Constitution. Mr. Jerry seemed to entertain the same doubt. So what they're saying is, I don't think we have the authority to be talking about any other form of government other than a purely federal form of government. And what was being proposed was one that moved us much more national, giving central control over the states. They defined it as national, being that the states can be forced to do things by the federal government, which they couldn't do under the Articles of Confederation, where a federal form of government, actions of the states was purely voluntary. Another point of order that was raised was from Mr. John Lansing, where he says the power of the convention was restrained to amendments of a federal nature. He's again making that very clear point. We're limited to a federal, strictly federal form of government. And he says the commissions, their delegate commissions, all proved this. And it was unnecessary and improper to go further. He even points out New York would never have concurred to sending delegates to this convention if she had supposed the deliberations were to turn into a consolidation of the states into a national government. And he ended up leaving the convention over this. Now, convention promoters will say, oh, but only that New York and maybe a couple other delegate commissions were so limited. Is that true? Because the delegates here are saying all of our commissions say that. Is that true? Who's right here? If you look at the delegate commissions, you'll find that every single delegate commission to the 1787 convention restricts them to render the federal Constitution adequate and gives no suggestion that they could create a different form. And so, again, if what the Convention of States position said was true, that they had any and all authority, these concerns should easily be refuted by one delegate standing up and saying, hey, look, here in my commission, it says we have any and all authority. But instead of that, we have delegates saying, well, we may not have the authority, but we need to do so anyway. For example, we have Edmund Randolph, who said there are great seasons when persons with limited powers are justified in exceeding them. Does that sound like he's saying we have any and all authority? Absolutely not. Madison says it was essential that such changes be instituted by informal and unauthorized propositions. So again, they're not saying they're authorized to do this, they're saying it's essential we do so anyway. James Wilson admits that the convention did not act at all upon the powers given to them by their states. Madison supported this view, explaining that instead of acting on the power of the states, they acted on the right of the people to abolish or alter their governments, making a reference back to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. He further states that the people were in fact the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over, they could alter constitutions as they please. So again, he's implying if we hadn't resorted to the people, we couldn't have altered the Constitution as we pleased. How did they resort to the people? By changing the ratification process. According to their delegate commissions, the majority of them pointed out the fact that in the Articles of Confederation, every state legislature needed to approve whatever changes came out of that convention. So they changed that ratification process to just conventions, not the state legislatures, and to only 9 states rather than all 13. So they exceeded their commissions and they changed the ratification process. This is absolutely irrefutable history. And the point here is this: by appealing to the power of the people, they made this action legitimate. Those who are claiming, oh, the Constitution, if we claim that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 overstepped its bounds, then we're claiming the Constitution is illegitimate. Not at all. Because they changed the ratification process legitimately to the highest power in the land, the people themselves. The way they established the Constitution was absolutely legitimate, and it would be equally legitimate today for a convention to do the same thing. Now, again, if the Convention of States claims were true, that the delegates had any and all authority, none of this history should exist. There never should have been this point of order raised, and there never should have been the justifications that I read to you saying, you know what, maybe we don't have the authority, but we need to do so anyway. Obviously, the delegates knew their commissions, knew that they didn't have the authority in their commissions, which is why they appealed to the higher authority. So I want to bring up one other topic here. First of all, just to kind of conclude that section, to those who in this hearing disagree with me on this topic of the history of 1787, or those who are still online, again, I invite you, send me your proof that the convention delegates were actually given, as Mark Meckler said, that their commissions said that they have any and all authority necessary. You'll never find that language in there.
Mr. Brown, can we get you to wrap up? We've got a lot more folks behind you and we're running out of time.
Yes, I will
Thank you.
conclude with just a quick point out here that I have been invited on numerous occasions to debate the leaders of the Convention of States organization and many others. In fact, in February of 2021, the Montana Senate leadership sent a formal certified letter to the head of Convention of States, Mark Meckler, inviting him to debate me in the Senate chambers, which he refused to respond. Later, when he was asked about it, he said that will never happen. Just this last May, Michael Ferris, co-founder of the Convention of States, was booked by the Republican Women of Central Iowa to do a public debate, which he had booked his tickets and confirmed that he'd attend until he was informed that he would be debating myself, Robert Brown, at which point he immediately pulled out of the debate and refused. I think that tells a lot. Those who refuse to do an open, honest, and fair debate on this topic, you have to wonder why. You have to ask why. So I'm going to conclude with this statement from James Madison, where he was opposing a convention in his day. He says, "The friends of the Constitution are fixed in opposition to a second convention. Those who have opposed the Constitution, on the other hand, are zealous for a second convention. And it's equally certain that there are others who urge a second convention with the insidious hope of throwing all things into confusion and subverting the Constitution just established, if not subverting the Union itself. I urge you to support the Constitution, support enforcing the Constitution, and don't put the Constitution at risk through a convention which Madison himself told us was a very dangerous action." Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Opponents, we're almost halfway through our time. We've got about 11 left, so please try to keep it short. We'll go to Christine Glenn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for listening to my testimony committee. I want to express my strong opposition to this resolution. I understand the value of a balanced budget, but I believe an Article 5 approach poses significant risks to the stability, integrity, and future of our country and nation, just because I don't think we're prepared to hold an Article 5 convention. So many people have talked about this, but I believe that we have to have clear rules and procedures for all aspects, especially the ratification method needs to be approved by a majority of Americans before we actually hold one. A convention of states would not be led by the states as a cohesive group, but by 50 small groups sent by each state. How effective can that be? And looking at Montana, many of us are unhappy and frustrated by the legislature's failure to address critical problems like housing availability and cost, property taxes, health concerns. In too many cases, there's a lot of focus put on political hot buttons that don't address the problems most Montanans are facing. How can I know that those the legislature selects to represent me, or ordinary Montanans, at a convention would actually do this rather than the political hot buttons? Given the polarization and rancor and paralyzation in politics today, we need to use a tried and true method to amend our Constitution rather than something new untested, and undefined. I respectfully urge you to vote no on this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Glenn. Next opponent, Kim Daly.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee. My name is Kim Daly, spelled D as in Delta, A-I-L-E-Y, and I am the Precinct 25 captain for the Ravalli County Republican Central Committee. Today, various factions are lobbying state legislators to ask Congress to call an Article 5 convention, usually backed by George Soros or the COS. They use various appealing hooks, such as congressional term limits, balancing the federal budget, taking money out of politics, or limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. But nothing in Article 5 limits the convention to subjects specified by state legislatures. So the subject of a state's application for a convention is nothing more than bait designed to get them to support an Article 5 convention. Here we have HJ 5, proposing to amend the Constitution of the United States to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. The 34 legislators proposing HJ 5 are using these subjects to bait you into supporting a convention that they cannot limit to these subjects. Don't be fooled. The phrase, a convention for proposing amendments, which appears within Article 5, doesn't restrict the delegates to the convention to proposing amendments. That's because our Declaration of Independence recognizes that a people have the self-evident right to alter or abolish their government and set up a new government. We have invoked this right twice. In 1776, we invoked it to throw off the British monarchy, and in 1787, James Madison invoked it to throw off our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and set up our current constitution, which created a new form of government. There were defects in the Articles of Confederation, so on February 21st, 1787, the Continental Congress called a convention to be held in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But the delegates ignored their instructions from Congress and similar instructions from the states and wrote a new constitution which created a new form of government. If we hold a convention today, the delegates will have the same power to get rid of our second constitution and impose a third constitution. New constitutions have already been prepared or are in the works. In one of them, the Constitution for the New States of America, the states are dissolved and replaced by regional governments answerable to the new national government, and the citizens are to be disarmed. You can see the real agenda of those financing the push for a convention. A convention provides the opportunity, under the pretext of merely seeking amendments, to replace our existing constitution with a new constitution that moves us into a completely new system of government. This war over our constitution is not between conservatives and liberals. It is between the globalists and those of us who want to maintain our existing constitution and national sovereignty. Of the 4 U.S. Supreme Court justices who warned against another convention, 2 were liberals and 2 were conservatives. Even James Madison, the father of our Constitution, was opposed to an Article 5 convention to consider adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. When asked whether a convention should be called to consider adding a Bill of Rights, Madison said, quote, "Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under every propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second," unquote. Today, we do not have propitious circumstances. Can you imagine opening up our Constitution for delegates to have the power to propose anything they see fit in today's society? In a society where we have kicked God out, where we have people trying to change their biological gender, where we are brainwashing and mutilating our
We
children.
need you to get back on the bill, Ms. Daly, please.
Okay, what would we end up with? The real problem isn't even that we need to amend the Constitution, but that we need to follow the Constitution. Besides, if this was actually about amending the Constitution, we can amend it without doing an Article 5 convention. So why would you put our Constitution at risk? Since the creation of our current Constitution, no Article 5 convention of states has ever been convened. So the question remains about how such a convention would function in practice. You are at a fork in the road, and this really matters to the future of our country. So I urge you to carefully consider the knowns and unknowns of the convention method and vote no on HJ 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daly. Next opponent, Mary Harlow, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm here this morning to ask you firmly and strongly to please vote against HJ 5, Article 5 constitutional amendment. The reason for my comments is this. There's a difference between fear and reality. The reality is that there are efforts underway already to bend the Constitution. And a great example of that is Article 14 that guarantees a citizen's birthright. It already is under charge, and the Constitution has not even been opened up. A balanced federal budget is a red herring. It's used by proponents to support an Article 5 convention. The Constitution, as it's written, is not broken, and it doesn't need to be fixed. The reality is that given our current state and federal governments, an Article 5 convention could throw the country into turmoil, creating legal and political battles of great consequences to our nation and our future generations. The fear is that this is a power grab that will put control of our country into the hands of politicians and special interests. I honestly and forthcomingly request that you please do not vote for an Article 5 convention. Thank you very much for this opportunity to provide testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Harlow. Next, we'll go to Vaughn Daly.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I'm Vaughn Daly. It's spelled D as in Delta, A-I-L-E-Y. I live in Ravalli County, and I'm pretty much the same across the board. I especially like Robert Brown. And I heard in the beginning, the guardians of the Constitution. And we, as people, we need to know our legislators, right? So today I'm going to keep this very short. I want to focus on the balanced budget, what they're talking about, and our sovereignty. And that we have to be knowledgeable on our budget system, and we have to not be deceived. If you know how our money system works, then you know it was hijacked in 1913, and our wealth has been stolen since then. If you're educated, you know I'm referring to the Federal Reserve. If you're not familiar with the Federal Reserve and how it works, I highly recommend reading the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Highly educational. And looking at the people that introduced the bill is very concerning to me. If you're confused, then I wonder if you know your legislators. Don't be deceived and educate yourself. The next book I recommend reading is The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Clausen. Highly recommended. If you understand the monetary system, you understand the dangers of just trying to do an amendment will not fix it. And the dangers of HJ 5 in our country, you'll realize you need to vote no on HJ 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Next opponent, Sean Meehan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. I'm Sean Meehan, a retired Air Force veteran, and 11 years ago I founded Guard the Constitution specifically to fight this issue. And I'd like to ask us to quickly get into proper frame of mind to discuss this. I always think of the movie Saving Private Ryan when they're charging Omaha Beach on D-Day and the incredible graphic sacrifices that were made. In the history of our great country, nearly 1.4 million veterans have given their life to guard our Constitution after pledging an oath to it. And having carried some of the deceased back from the Black Hawk Down operation, this is very much in my mind. Yes, Article 5 is in the Constitution, but it's in it for the right reason. Declaring war is in the Constitution, so I asked my friends, what country are we going to start bombing tonight just to use the whole Constitution? Yes, that's facetious, but I think it makes a point. This is not one state, one vote. They can't guarantee that. Your very own retired law professor, Dr. Robert Nadelson, said it's one state, one vote, quote, although a convention is free to change the rule of suffrage, and that's in the 2013 ALEC handbook. Also, currently, there are movements afoot to force Congress to call a convention using what we call the time machine bill that goes back to the 1970s, claiming we're already over 34 states. This is Texas Congressman Arrington put this bill forward, and I believe it's coming back again for the new Congress. And they make some dangerous, incredible assumptions. The most being, this would be subject neutral. No matter what you've passed, the subject would be stripped off, a call would occur, they would all count for your 34, and your limits would not matter. Also in 2021 in the South Carolina Judiciary Committee, ALEC attorney Mr. Bidoff publicly declared they are putting together litigation to force Congress to call a consolidated, unlimited convention. This is dangerous. Also, a Mr. Paul Gardner who served at the Georgia
we need you not to use proper names, please. Thank you.
Okay, the Georgia Coalition's director for Convention of States stated that that was a strategy of theirs to consolidate calls regardless of topic. Really quickly on the balanced budget amendment, the United States Constitution already contains a balanced budget. Article 1, Section 8 clearly lists the enumerated powers. That's all we're allowed to spend. I'm sorry, that's all we're allowed to do. Logically, if that's all they're allowed to do, that's all they're allowed to spend money on. Since the 70s, we've been under consistent multiple emergency declarations that would exceed any limitations. As to term limits, did you know that the Articles of Confederation had term limits? The founders removed them. It's talked about in Federalist 53 why they did it. You actually want some seasoned and experienced people in Congress. Convention of States the last few years has changed it from just wanting to limit Congress to limiting Congress and the staff. I understand where they're going with that, but who does that leave in charge? The lobbyists. Don't think anybody thinks that's good. And term limits just simply don't work. Respectfully, my state of Nevada in 2014, the people voted against a commerce tax by 78%, massively bipartisan. Months later at our session, our new first in 30 years Republican majority voted for a very same tax. It's just, it doesn't work. However, if you're familiar with Congresswoman Boebert in Colorado and her victory over an entrenched incumbent, and if you want to be bipartisan, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Okay, Mr. Meehan, we're going to cut you off. We've told you repeatedly not to use names. We will go to the next opponent, Janine Henson, please.
Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Janine Hansen. I am representing National Legal Forum. Phyllis Schlafly, our founding president, worked for years since the 1980s opposing Article 5 constitutional conventions. I think it is most instructive to look at H.R. 5 and the language of the Convention of States. It states that one of the purposes of COS is to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. This opens 6 of the 7 articles of the Constitution to amendment. We all know that this was the original intent of the U.S. Constitution to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. But this purpose was undermined by the 16th and 17th Amendments, income tax and direct election of senators, which the state legislators voted to include as part of the Constitution. They essentially destroyed federalism, and the states voted for it. Montana now receives some 46% of their state revenue from the federal government. The Convention of States has an unlimited agenda of new amendments for our Constitution. In COS's pocket guide on pages 33 and 34, you can read about dozens of possible amendments, including healthcare, education, energy policy, land use, and many more. Today, we heard they want to do something with the Supreme Court. Their proposals demonstrate that they want an unlimited Article 5 convention. In September of 2023, California passed an application for an Article 5 convention, which completely guts the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. We have always been concerned that any Article 5 convention could jeopardize our Second Amendment. If there is an Article 5 convention, California will be there, along with all the other states. Each state will have their own agenda. This is not an Article 5, and it does not limit the subjects or of the applications or the amendments. Montana has 2 U.S. senators and 2 congressmen. California has 2 U.S. senators and 52 congressmen. The Convention of States tries to make us believe that each state will have 1 vote. This is preposterous. There have been many bills in Congress regarding rules determining how delegates in each state will be selected at an Article 5 convention, showing that Congress fully plans to set the rules. Each of these bills uses the number of electoral college votes each state has to determine the number of votes for each state. So Montana will have 4 votes and California 54. The Convention of States resolution opens Article 5 convention to unlimited amendments, and from their own literature, that is what they want. But they won't be the only ones there pushing their agenda. California and other blue states like New York will also be there pushing for their agendas. We need to also recognize that proponents of Article 5 are working on aggregation theories now to combine all of the Article 5 applications since 1789 in New York to make sure they can get an open convention and not limit it. I think it's very important to look at Article 5 in the very last sentence, which tells us what can be amended in the Constitution. And it says, this is the one thing that cannot be amended, and that means everything else can, including Article 5. It says only that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So the only thing is that we have to have 2 senators. Otherwise, they can amend Article 5, change the ratification process. And so when they say we were going to be sure that we have 38 states voting on how these amendments are accepted, there is no guarantee because the convention itself can change the ratification process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Please vote no on H.R. 5 and protect our Constitution and our sacred liberties. I have submitted my testimony with additional information.
Thank you, Ms. Hanson. Next opponent, Craig McClure. You're on mute, Mr. McClure.
Are we with you now?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Craig McClure. That's M-C-C-L-U-R-E. I live in Polson. No document is perfect, but I believe the U.S. Constitution is a foundational document that protects Americans' fundamental freedoms. Opening our Constitution up for changes through a convention of states is a risky and untested approach. It is not the best way to address the need for a balanced budget. A convention of states could be uncontrollable and result in putting our freedoms and constitutional rights up for grabs. There is no guaranteed way to limit the scope. We have an existing process to amend the Constitution that has successfully worked 27 times over the last 238 years. Applying to call a convention of states is not the best way to protect future generations. I agree that we have a people problem. Please hold our representatives responsible and have them consider using the more specific amendment approach. I ask you to vote no on HJ5. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. McClure. We'll next go to Dan Happel.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Dan Happel, that's spelled Happel, and I am from Pony, Montana in Madison County. I ask that you vote no on HJ5 for the following reasons. We live in a very volatile time where it is exceedingly difficult to get political consensus on any subject. An Article 5 convention that opens our brilliantly written U.S. Constitution to partisan bickering is absolute madness. The reason we experience so many problems with runaway spending is because Congress has been ignoring or intentionally violating our existing Constitution for at least the past 125 years. The amendment process is the way to do changes to our Constitution. It's intended to make those needed changes the way it was originally intended by our founders. We need to use that process without opening the Pandora's box at an exceedingly contentious time in our national history. Proponents say that those of us who oppose the idea of an Article 5 convention are fearmongers. Well, that's not true. We aren't fearmongers. We're actually exhibiting a little bit of common sense at a time that most federal and state governments are unduly influenced by powerful special interests and big money. Please vote no on HJ5. Thank you for hearing my term.
Thank you, Mr. Happel. Next, we have Roxanne Hoblet.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Roxanne Hoblet, H-O-B as in boy, L-I-T-T, and I am from Bozeman. I am opposing HJ5 for the following reasons. Our U.S. Constitution is a foundational document that protects us as Americans. While not perfect, we have the process of amending this Constitution that has worked throughout our country's history, making it a malleable document. Changing our U.S. Constitution through a convention of states looks like it could be chaotic, risky, costly, as we do not know what each state will want to bring or put forth and who will be leading. Will it be states with larger populations than Montanans, who may have different needs, desires, or wants than ours? Our state legislature needs to focus on Montana's needs for this legislative session. The rising costs of housing and food and other goods, and even the lack of housing and childcare, and rising property taxes, rising utility rates. This is especially necessary now since our state legislature only meets every other year. So I urge you to vote no on HJ5. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hoblet. I don't see any other hands raised, but I believe Daniel Keeter is an opponent. Thank you. Daniel Keeter.
Can the committee members hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Daniel Keeter, K-E-D-E-R. I live in Great Falls, Montana. I'm a retired Air Force officer and a member of the John Birch Society since 1995. I am testifying in opposition to HJ5. Let me remind and assure the committee members your decision on this bill will not bring on or prevent an apocalypse. you will not save or destroy the nation. However, you do have the difficult responsibility of governance, not the easy job of advocacy or opposition. You are responsible and accountable to your constituents and to the other citizens of Montana. In the case of this bill, your decision will also affect all the citizens of the United States. This bill is one of hundreds, if not thousands, that you will decide on during this legislative session. My intention this morning is to help you make a decision on this bill that is in the best interests of all Montanans and all Americans. I mean to achieve this by posing a very brief set of rhetorical questions. If the federal government has ceased to live under a proper interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, as this bill alleges in lines 18 and 19, why would that same government live under a proper interpretation of any amendments? If the solemn duty of the states is to protect the liberty of the people, line 20, and state legislatures are to be guardians of liberty, line 12, why not start performing those functions right now, this session? Why are you waiting for the concurrence of 33 other state legislatures? How about rejecting the federal money we use for state expenditures? Stop pretending Montana has a balanced budget. Nullify federal government abuses of power this session without waiting for permission from the very government that is abusing its power. How realistic is it to assume a convention of states can be limited to specific amendments, or that other state representatives at this convention will agree with your desired solutions, especially given the plain text of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, the lack of consensus among the states, and the lack of consensus regarding this issue among legal and constitutional experts. And I'll refer you to Congressional Research Service Report 42589, Article 5 Convention, Contemporary Issues for Congress. The file was a little bit too large for me to upload the whole thing to this committee. If it will be of use, I will attempt later today to upload a link. It's available on the Congress's website. It's a Congressional Research Service report. So it's not so much that that there's fear or that we know for sure what's going to happen. There is a disagreement among the legal experts, among the actual bona fide constitutional experts, on whether an Article 5 convention can in fact be limited to specific amendments or not. So it is not a settled issue, and that's the only point I'm trying to make here. What specific flaws in the U.S. Constitution have failed to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? What specifically in the U.S. Constitution has caused or allowed the federal government to be fiscally irresponsible and usurp power? Is this proposed cure addressing the real cause of the problem? And before I conclude, I would just like to maintain that the bastion of federalism is not Article 5. It is, in fact, Article 1 and the 10th Amendment. So in conclusion, I thank the committee members for their time and consideration. I hope answering these questions will assist you in making your decision. I trust you will make what I believe is the right decision for our citizens and kill this bill in committee.
Thank you, Mr. Keeter. Our last opponent is Claire Parker.
My name is Claire Parker, that's P-A-R-K-E-R. I urge you to vote no on HJ5 because it puts the U.S. Constitution at great risk. The Constitution has often been called a divine document because it contains the safeguards for all our freedoms and personal liberties. An Article 5 convention held at the federal level is a convention of the people represented by delegates for the purpose of altering the federal Constitution. The fact is, if the delegates so choose, they can scrap the Constitution and write a new one. And all that has to happen is for the people to ratify it. That is what happened in 1787. Enemies of freedom could easily use an Article 5 convention to substitute our inalienable rights, God-given rights, that are protected in the Constitution. And then we would be stuck with human rights, rights granted by governments, not God, such as the United Nations with its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees nothing. According to its charter, all rights can be taken away by the UN at any time. A population unaware of the divine genius that crafted our Constitution and being ignorant of its founding principles could easily be fooled and not even see the difference, and states would have no recourse because the people are sovereign. Such changes can be accomplished through ratification of the states or otherwise by the people directly. Whatever interests or powers the states may think they have, the people are sovereign, and delegates may go to them directly, regardless of their commissions or the rules set by Congress. Since Article 5 conventions offer the purpose of proposing amendments, altering, or even writing a new constitution, everything is on the table. The states have no authority when the people want to change the government to tell them how they may and may not change it. And to attempt to do so could result in major litigation, which globalists can easily fund. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was a runaway convention. Someone whose name I will not mention claims otherwise. He fabricates that delegates were commissioned by the states to propose or do whatsoever they deem necessary. If you can prove this to be the truth, for even one single delegate, be sure to claim your $10,000 from Robert Brown. The fact is, their commissions were to do whatever was necessary to fix the Articles of Confederation, not to scrap it and write a new constitution. The historical record shows that delegates all admitted they exceeded their authority, and Congress and the states complained that delegates went beyond their commissions. Black's Law Dictionary defines an Article 5 Constitutional Convention as a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people of a state or nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending its constitution. According to this definition, conventions are unlimited, as constitutions can be written or rewritten at a convention. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 fit this definition, and it changed the government radically, for the better to be sure, but today it can be changed much for the worse. Were a Constitutional Convention to be held today, the Constitution can be relegated to the dustbin, as was the original U.S. Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. The states would have no power to stop it, and to assume that power would be a usurpation of the people's rights to alter, amend, or abolish their government. Tell me where in the Constitution is the power to prevent delegates from proposing whatever they, as representatives of the people, see fit to propose, regardless of commissions. All our freedom is in our Constitution. Our personal liberty is protected by our Constitution. We must safeguard the Constitution, not put it at risk with a convention that could be seized by powerful, elite, globalist interests wanting a new world order, that want to get rid of individual freedom and liberty guaranteed in our Constitution in exchange for the good of the collective, a communist totalitarian concept. Americans all know that without individual freedom, there is no freedom. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. That ends our opponent testimony. We'll go to informational witnesses. Are there any informational witnesses? Seeing none. Questions from the committee? I'll ask committee that we put folks on the Health and Human Services Committee first because they have to leave here in about 5 minutes. Representative Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First question for the sponsor, please.
Representative Clacken.
Mr. Chair, Representative Marshall.
Mr. Chair, Representative Clacken, I've got a few questions here. The first one, we've heard it from both from a lot of the opponents. If the voters of Montana, if they don't vote, say these amendments come out after a convention, if they don't vote for the amendments, we turn it down here in Montana, but yet they're ratified by the other states. What other recourse do we have?
If they're ratified by other states, it becomes part of the Constitution of the United States.
So what recourse do we have then? Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Follow up. What recourse?
We abide by the Constitution of the United States. And to answer your question directly, as you can tell, we don't, in terms of we can go to court, we can file lawsuits, declare that constitutional change unconstitutional, but it is part of the Constitution if it's revised, if it's ratified.
So the next question is this, then, the delegates. We've heard a lot about the delegates. Are they selected by they're selected by the state, but according to what? I mean, is it by the electoral college process? Do we get one? You know, and then it was also mentioned that there was consequences if they didn't adhere to this document. What would those consequences be?
I'll have to defer the second part of that question, but the first part of that question is we have a long, rich history, 300 plus years of how conventions work. When states get together to have conventions, the states, to send their delegates, they select those delegates and send them with instructions. And Senator McGilvery has a bill here in Senate right now being heard, I think right now, supposed to be anyway, for the delegate selection process for the state of Montana. And if you like, he could answer that question more completely.
Yeah, refer there.
Redirect. Senator McGilvery, please.
Mr. Chair, Representative Marshall, the bill I have is Senate Bill 120. You can read it online for the interest of time, but it basically has a joint session of the legislature that chooses our delegates.
Okay, follow up for Senator McGilvery?
Yes.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, Senator McGilvery, it was mentioned that there would be consequences. Can you tell me what those consequences would be?
Yeah, they would be recalled. And also Shafalo versus Washington, a 2020 case says that states can control their delegates. So that's a constitutional case.
Okay, thank you. One last question, Mr. Chair. Go back to the sponsor or maybe to Mrs. Spar. Spar, I think that was her name. She mentioned nullification.
Online or in the room?
In the room.
Proponent?
Proponent.
Betty Jo Starr?
Starr.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Ms. Starr. Oh, she was excused.
Okay, well, let's go to the sponsor then, Mr.
Okay, Representative Clacken.
Mr. Chair, anyway, it was mentioned about nullification wouldn't work. And I'm just wondering, well, we do have an example of nullification. Could you elaborate on what they meant by nullification not being able to work?
Mr. Chair, Representative Marshall. Yeah, nullification, that's on a case-by-case basis. And the only way nullification would work is each case was litigated in each state, and each state refused to, that came out in the favor of the state. Nullification is not a constitutional process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from the committee? Representative Bob Lander.
Mr. Chair, for Senator McGilvery, please.
Senator McGilvery.
Mr. Chair, Representative.
Mr. Chair, good morning, Senator McGilvery. Appreciate you being here. Hearing all this testimony, I can only imagine what it must have been like when they were debating the Constitution initially. It had to be an incredible event. So the three limits that are spelled out in this HJ5, are they in line with what other states are doing? I mean, I've heard that California could do a lot more, but are ours in line with the others?
Mr. Chair, Representative, the Convention of States applications are all identical. So the 19 states that have passed Convention of States, they're identical applications. What California is doing is completely irrelevant to what we're doing. I don't remember what the person said. I think they said it was repealing the Second Amendment. Let's just say it was. You'd have to have 34 states pass an application to go to a convention to repeal the Second Amendment. That's not going to happen.
Follow up?
Follow.
Also heard testimony in regard to one state, one vote. Could you elaborate or explain that, please?
Right. All conventions of states in the history of the country, including the Constitutional Convention of 1787, were one state, one vote. And also, I would just add that Dreyer versus Blair, 1975 case said that in interpreting Article 5, you can look to history in that interpretation. So we'd always look to the history of conventions showing that one state, one vote is the rule for convention of states. So that would be what would be used.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Mr. Chair.
Any other HHS committee members have questions? I know you're all leaving here soon. Okay, seeing nothing from those, any questions from any member in general? Representative Gist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank everybody for a really robust debate on this important topic, proponents and opponents. This would be for probably Senator McGilvery.
Senator McGilvery.
Mr. Chair, Representative.
Thank you. Former Representative Galloway had mentioned the required application. Can you describe that a little bit more on, you touched on a little bit, but can you elaborate a little bit more on what that process is and how that's handled through the proposal?
Yeah, Article 5 says, this is important, and I think it addresses this question of runaway that's been brought up over and over and over again. Article 5 says on the application of the 34 of the several states, you have to have an application. Application controls what's discussed at the convention. We understand the application process very well. And I make this simple example, if I apply for a moose permit and the state of Montana gives me that moose permit, I cannot go out and shoot an elk or a cow or a horse or a deer. I can shoot the moose. Application controls what you're able to do. So that application that the 34 states have agreed on is what controls the subject at the convention, Mr. Chair.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow up.
Well, then, what if they have, let me say this. So they all have to agree on one application. It can't be a variance of an application?
Mr. Chair, Representative, yeah, there are over 400 different applications for a convention of states that are still outstanding. The reason you've never held a convention is because none of those applications aggregate to 34. You have to have 34 applications on the same subject to call a convention. And the reason the Convention of States is very thoughtful about this, and that every application is identical, because we want there to be no questions that those applications aggregate. Because you have to have 34 aggregated applications to call a convention, because they all have to be on the same subject or subjects.
All right, with your indulgence, just one more.
Follow up.
Okay, so we're going to change the line of thought there. We had one person online state that who's behind this? They said that it sounds like the World Economic Forum, one of the, not to mention names, but their name sounds kind of like Oros, is behind the Convention of States. Can you touch on that? I'd never heard that before.
Mr. Chair, Representative, thanks for the question. He who shall not be named is not behind Convention of States. As a matter of fact, he who should not be named, actually, when I had SJ2 last session, was his organization Common Cause, was sending out text messages to my constituents to oppose my resolution. So he who shall not be named is not supporting Convention of States.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions from the committee? Any further questions? Seeing none. Did I miss anyone? All right. Representative Teal, I'm looking right at you. All right. Representative Clacken, would you like to close on the bill, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, Mo, you've been sitting there a long time. I had a long, eloquent speech prepared. I will not cover most of it. I will cover some, but I do want to answer a couple of questions. I really appreciated Representative Millette and his question of do we have a people problem or a constitutional problem? He's exactly right. And I submit to you, we do have a constitutional problem brought on by the changing definitions of words in the Constitution, such as commerce, reasonable, necessary, general, common defense, general welfare. You know, I was one of those guys that said we currently do not follow the Constitution. You know, this Constitution like this, I used to believe that. I don't believe that anymore. I do believe we follow the Constitution, but we follow this one that's that thick, the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States. That's how those words get changed. That's how those definitions get changed. That's why this Convention of States is important to get those definitions back where they belong. You know, Article 1, Section 8 has been mentioned that we have 17 enumerated powers. And that's what we're talking about when we say basically put them back in their box. We know they're way outside the box. I don't think anybody will say that they're not outside of their 17 enumerated powers. That's the purpose of the convention. Get the definitions back to where they belong. If you want to change the definition of a word in the Constitution, submit an amendment. Change the definition. Just don't go through a court and say this is what it means now, because when those words were written back then, they meant very specific certain things that we don't think of that way. Commerce back then was just shipping of goods across a state line. That's all it had to do with. Anything within the state, the federal government had no control of. It wasn't their issue, it's a state issue. But now we know it is not just a state issue now. The federal government is very involved in that. And another one I want to answer is, you know, have not ever seen an application that goes up, and I happen to have one here. If I can dig through my stuff and find it, I hope I didn't lose it. But anyway, yeah, this basic piece of paper right here is what the actual application would look like. It's much like your HJ5 in wording and everything. It's just, you know, puts the state's name on there. And the part of the close I want to cover with, you know, we the people form the federal government. They're our child. We have not disciplined them well enough because for generations, we the people, I was included, haven't been paying attention to our civic duties to do these kinds of things in a serious way for the states to exert their power. Unfortunately, like one of the folks I talked to during, you know how I've talked to every one of you for the most part. Do you support or not support? One of those people who's not in this room, I said, what do you think of Convention of States? He says, I hate it. I go, whoa, this might be the wrong conversation. But he came out very succinctly. I don't know how to spell it out any better. He said, I hate it. I hate that we're in this position to actually have to consider it. So I want to take that as my mantra. I do not enjoy the idea of we're in this position, but here we are. I do want to point you to your handouts, that thick book, which you probably won't read. Maybe you will. You got a weekend. Please do. They spend a lot of time working on it, and they get a lot more thoughts in it. But in the back of that, there's a 2-page sheet stapled together that shows the number of people in your district that have signed the Convention of States. And we have another big pile of paper here that has lists of people. And if I might indulge you, Mr. Chair, can he explain these piles of paper? Can
anyone object on the committee? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This pile of paper represents 20,000 supporters in the state of Montana that have signed the Convention of States petition. They're broken down by district, so any of the representatives that'd like to look and see, you know, the signatures to prove that they're there, there's 30 per page, total 20,000. This other pile is a pile of petitions, citizen petitions to support the HJ5 resolution. They're from 61 districts in the state, and I think there's 156 in here. So I leave this for your
Can you provide copies for each of the members, please? Not serious. Just hand them to the Sergeant at Arms, please. Thank you. Continue with your close, please, Representative.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Fun levity, appreciate that. I do also want to say, from an elected official standpoint, you know, are we here worried about our next election, or are we here worried about the next generation? And I submit we ought to be looking for the next generation. Needless to say, I urge a due pass on HJ5. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And we did have a member ask if you could provide a copy of that COS application sheet that you had for us. We'd appreciate it. This will close the hearing on House Joint Resolution 5. Thank you to all that testified and spent all the time working on this. We appreciate it. Members, we're going to let the committee room change over, and we're going to start next on 223 as long as our bill sponsor is around. Okay, thank you.
All right, Rita, well, we're back. The committee just ended discussion on our resolution, and boy, there were some moments in there. There were some good moments, there were some bad moments, there were some ugly moments. I did like at the end, Representative Clacken, he had some strong comments at the end to close out that discussion, and he even held up that big stack of papers, 20,000 signatures in the state of Montana who support Convention of States. I'd like to get your recap and some commentary on what you thought over the last couple hours.
Wow. Well, moments, Andrew, there were a lot of moments. That was 3 hours of a committee hearing, maybe our longest ever. I'm going to have to check our record books on that too. But for anyone who's joining us late, you have been watching the Montana House Business and Labor Committee hear public testimony on our Article 5 Convention of States legislation in Montana. That's HJ5. So we had our House sponsor, Representative Shane Clacken, introduce the bill, but we also got a fine appearance from our Senate champion, Senator Tom McGilvray. He was there to give a little bit of testimony, but also to provide some great answers to questions by committee members there at the end. The main thing that stood out to me, Andrew, and I'll be brief because I want to get our regional director, Deanna Beckett, on in just a moment, but our Montana team was on fire, as good as any team I have ever seen to testify before a legislative committee. They were absolutely brilliant. They were brief. They were to the point. They made all the pertinent points. They did not repeat themselves. They were professional, and they were from Montana. As you may have noticed, most of the opponents were not from Montana. They were from out of state. So just very impactful testimony. And let's bring on Deanna Beckett, our regional director for the Wild West region. Deanna, you have to be so proud of that Montana team. What's your reaction?
Very proud of that Montana team. They did this in 2023. That, I think it was their first run through this very well prepared and very well practiced testimony. They have added to it and tweaked it, perfected it, and actually more than 20 of them gathered last night in a hotel conference room with Senator McGilvray and with Shane McClacken to review all of this and prepare everyone and go through the spelling of their last name. I can only assume that Tom said you're going to have to spell your last name. So it was great that everybody was prepared for that. And I know one of the things that people can tell that we're from Convention of States is they know that they have to say their name, thank the committee, and say what district they're from. And our team did it perfectly. I do want to give a shout out to one of our team members, Terry Kramer. He testified, and he is the one with, and a handful of team around him that created this testimony many years ago. And they just worked on it, perfected it, and it was so well. Of course, Michael Ferris called it out, and I saw some talk in the background. Mark Meckler wants a standard operating procedure.
Yeah, well, they just did a fantastic job. We're all very, very proud of that Montana team. As you mentioned, Deanna, we also did get to hear some expert testimony from our very own Mike Ferris. And then, as we normally do, we got to hear from the conspiracy theorists and fear mongers, and they were out in full force as well. Although obviously they either didn't show up in person, or not very many of them showed up in time to get a seat in that committee hearing room, because our supporters packed it out, which was awesome. But yeah, we heard some just wild and crazy things coming from the opponents. And one thing I want to say, and then I'll get your last wrap up comments, Andrew. We were not expecting a vote in this committee today, so don't take that as any negative sign. We knew that this committee was not planning to vote today. We are hoping that they will vote this through committee sometime next week. So stay tuned and we'll keep you posted on that. Andrew, Deanna, any last remarks before we wrap it up?
It was exciting to hear the number of supporters in the room. We got a first report of over 20, and our state director, one of our state directors, Montana is led by 2 state directors. You heard them today, Joe and Dan. There were 32 supporters in that room and maybe 8 opponents. So it was exciting to hear that we outnumbered them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of briefly throw a few things out there that I noticed, it's just our team is just, they are so well organized and they're so professional, so polite. And I think that is what really stood out to me during this entire hearing. And I just love how the Montana team, they came and they talked about Article 5. They were professional and they didn't get into the weeds about the runaway convention, any of that. They stayed on point, and I just absolutely loved that. And then hearing from you, Deanna, that 20 of them gathered the night before to practice, it just shows you how serious our grassroots take this, and it's just incredible. And Deanna, thank you for being here. This is the 3rd time in 1 week that you are joining us to give some analysis and to recap a hearing or Senate action. So thank you for taking the time to join us. And Rita, looks like we have Mark. So, Mark, I'd love to get your reaction to what you saw in that hearing today.
Yeah, and I want to keep it brief because obviously we've been here for a long time watching this. I echo everything that Rita said. This is one of the best performances I've ever seen. I do want a standard operating procedure out of this. The testimony was written. Everybody knew exactly what they were supposed to say. Everybody played their own part. It was 100% professional. I've seen professional lobbyists all over the country in most of the states. These guys were as good as anybody I've ever seen. I just don't know how you could do any better than this. I think other teams could do as well, but I just don't think you could top this with much. And I think this is the result of 10 years of hard work of a professional leadership team there that is doing an extraordinary job. I'm really excited by it. And then I have to mention that when you flip back and now you go to the opponents, it's the exact opposite. I mean, they're disheveled, they're disorganized, they don't know what they're saying. They're saying things that aren't true, first of all, but they're doing it in a very unconvincing, disorganized, disheveled way. Same old arguments just being recycled. They're not coordinated. A lot of them are from out of state. I think that's important to note, is that all our folks are in state, in district, on target. I'm over the moon. I couldn't be happier about that performance. And so we'll see what happens. The vote. Do we know when the vote's going to come down, Rita, from that committee?
Should be next week. Yep.
Okay, so we'll get the vote next week, and then hopefully the floor, and we'll see a strong vote out of the Senate, and then we got to work the House. I know the House is a little bit harder there. We'll see what happens, but I'm feeling pretty good. I mean, this is a great start to the year. This is now, we've been ticking off a few committee hearings here. They're all going well. The teams are all doing great. Again, I want people to understand this is not overnight. This is 11 years of effort by people. Deanna been here in the long haul, Andrew, Rita, all of us here in the long haul. 11 years of effort to get to this moment. It takes a long time to be that good, and those people were that good today.
Absolutely.
All right, Deanna, before we let you go, what's your call to action to everyone watching and to the Montana team?
Call to action is keep practicing. We've got a Senate committee once we pass the House, and that too, I don't need to tell the team that, but call your legislators. That is the most important. And another nugget, we mentioned that big pile that Dan brought forth represented over 20,000 petitions. They passed that mark just before Christmas, and they were so excited to pass that 20,000 mark. And I think they've actually passed 21.
That's awesome. Well, Deanna, we're going to have you back next week because your states have more exciting things going on next week. So you have become a regular and we enjoy having you. Deanna, Mark, thanks for joining us.
All right, with that, well, we're going to sign off. Thank you so much for tuning in to this special live coverage of the Montana House Committee hearing, and we're going to see you next week. All right, everyone, we got a country to save, so it's time to get back to work.